Have you ever wondered why your mind never truly rests? Why, even after the conversation ends, you keep replaying it in your head over and over, searching for the perfect explanation, the perfect response, the perfect way to make people finally understand you. They told you peace comes from being heard, from being validated, from making others see your intentions clearly. But if that were true, why do you still feel exhausted? Why does your heart still feel heavy, even after explaining yourself 100 times? The truth is, the more you need everyone to understand you, the more trapped your mind becomes. Buddhism teaches that suffering begins the moment your inner peace depends on someone else's approval. Because no matter how carefully you explain yourself, no matter how pure your intentions are, some people will still misunderstand you. Some people will never fully see your heart. And tonight, you will begin to understand why that is not your prison to carry. As you listen to these teachings, something inside you will slowly begin to loosen. The endless mental noise will begin to fade. The emotional weight you have been dragging for years will start to feel lighter. And for the first time in a long time, you may finally feel the quiet freedom of no longer needing permission to be at peace. This is not just something to help you fall asleep. This is the beginning of emotional freedom. Are you ready? Let's begin. And the painful part is that most people never realize this is what is keeping their mind exhausted. They think the problem is the argument, the rejection, the misunderstanding, or the conflict itself. But the real suffering often begins afterward, in the silence, when the mind refuses to let the moment die. Long after the conversation has ended, something inside keeps searching for one more explanation, one more chance to finally feel understood. What makes this even heavier is that the mind slowly turns into a courtroom where you are constantly defending yourself against invisible accusations. And the more you try to mentally correct people's opinions, the more restless your inner world becomes. There is a quiet kind of exhaustion that comes from always feeling misunderstood. It is not the kind of tiredness sleep can fix. It follows people into the middle of the night, into showers, into quiet car rides, into ordinary moments where the body is present, but the mind is still trapped in conversations that already ended. Some people carry entire arguments in their heads for years, not because they enjoy suffering, but because a part of them still hopes that one perfect explanation could finally remove the pain. That is the hidden trap most people never see. They believe the exhaustion comes from other people not understanding them, when in reality the exhaustion comes from the endless attempt to force understanding. The mind becomes addicted to rehearsing, correcting, defending, clarifying, proving, and explaining. It keeps replaying emotional moments like a broken machine that does not know how to shut itself off. Buddhism teaches that attachment is one of the deepest roots of suffering. Most people think attachment only means attachment to money, relationships, or possessions. But there is another attachment that quietly destroys peace from the inside. It is attachment to being understood, attachment to controlling how other people see you, attachment to making sure nobody walks away with the wrong idea about who you are. The moment your peace depends on somebody fully understanding your heart, your mind loses the ability to rest. Because human beings are unpredictable. Some people misunderstand because they are hurt. Some misunderstand because they are distracted. Some misunderstand because they only see life through their own wounds. And some people simply do not have the emotional depth to understand you at all. Yet the mind keeps fighting reality as if clarity can be forced. That is why certain people feel mentally exhausted all the time without realizing why. Their body may be sitting quietly, but internally they are in constant emotional motion. One part of the mind is defending itself. Another part is preparing future explanations. Another part is replaying old conversations, trying to improve them. And underneath all of this is a deep fear that says, If people misunderstand me, maybe I will lose love, connection, safety, or acceptance. This fear usually begins long before adulthood. Many people who constantly explain themselves grew up in environments where their emotions were ignored, mocked, dismissed, or misunderstood. As children, they learned that being understood felt emotionally necessary for survival. They learned that they had to over-explain their feelings just to be heard. They learned that silence often meant emotional abandonment. A child who constantly had to prove their feelings often becomes an adult who constantly defends their intentions. This is why some people feel panic the moment they realize someone misunderstood them. The nervous system reacts as if something dangerous is happening. Even small misunderstandings can feel emotionally unbearable because they awaken an old wound that says, if people see me incorrectly, I may not be safe emotionally. So the mind rushes to explain. It rushes to send another message, another paragraph, another clarification. It searches desperately for emotional resolution. But the tragedy is that the temporary relief never lasts, because the deeper issue was never the misunderstanding itself. The deeper issue is the emotional dependency on being understood. And this dependency quietly steals enormous amounts of life energy. Think about how much time human beings spend mentally explaining themselves to people who are not even present anymore. Entire days disappear inside imaginary conversations. People sit in silence while mentally arguing with former partners, parents, co-workers, strangers online, or people from years ago. The body remains in the present, but the mind stays trapped inside emotional resistance. Buddhism often speaks about the suffering created by resistance to reality. Reality says, some people will misunderstand you. The ego says, no, they must understand me correctly. Reality says, you cannot fully control another person's perception. The ego says, keep trying harder. And that battle creates endless exhaustion. What makes this even more painful is that many people confuse over-explaining with honesty. They believe constant emotional clarification means they are being open, authentic, or good-hearted. But sometimes over-explaining is not honesty at all. Sometimes it is fear wearing the mask of communication, fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of judgment, fear of losing control over how others see you. That is why some people explain themselves even when nobody asked for an explanation. Their nervous system has become conditioned to anticipate misunderstanding before it even happens. They prepare emotional defenses in advance because they are unconsciously trying to avoid future pain. Over time, this creates a restless mind that never fully relaxes. Even peaceful moments become contaminated by mental rehearsal. A person may be sitting with family, eating dinner, watching a movie, or lying in bed, yet internally they are preparing explanations for conversations that may never even happen. This is one of the hidden reasons modern minds feel so overwhelmed. People are not only carrying real conversations, they are carrying thousands of imaginary ones too. The human mind was never designed to constantly monitor and manage every perception others have of us. Yet many people spend their entire lives doing exactly that. They walk through life emotionally scanning faces, tones, pauses, and reactions, searching for signs that someone misunderstood them. The moment they sense disapproval, the mind becomes restless again. And the exhausting part is that this cycle has no finish line. Even if one person understands you, another person may not. Even if you explain yourself perfectly today, tomorrow someone else may judge you unfairly. Even if you finally clear one misunderstanding, another one will eventually appear. So the mind remains trapped in endless emotional maintenance. Buddhist teachings point towards something radically freeing. Peace does not come from controlling perception. Peace comes from releasing attachment to perception itself. This does not mean becoming cold, careless, or emotionally disconnected. It simply means understanding a deeper truth. Your worth is not created by other people's understanding of you. Most people know this intellectually, but emotionally they still depend on external validation to feel okay internally. That is why misunderstanding feels so threatening. It shakes identity itself. But there comes a moment in emotional growth where a person begins to see something clearly. Not everyone has the ability to understand you at the depth you wish to be understood. And chasing universal understanding is one of the fastest ways to destroy inner peace. Some people will reduce your intentions to their assumptions. Some will project their own fears onto you. Some will only hear what confirms their emotional biases. And some people will misunderstand you no matter how gently, honestly, or carefully you speak. At first, this realization feels painful, but eventually it becomes liberating. Because once you truly accept this, the mind slowly stops fighting impossible battles. There is incredible peace in realizing you do not need to attend every misunderstanding you are invited to. Not every accusation deserves a defense. Not every opinion deserves your emotional energy. Not every misunderstanding needs correction. And not every version of you living in someone else's mind is your responsibility to manage. This realization changes everything internally. The mind begins to soften. Mental noise becomes quieter. The desperate urge to explain slowly loses its grip. For the first time, silence stops feeling dangerous. Many people are afraid of silence because silence leaves room for uncertainty. When you stop explaining yourself, you lose control over how others interpret you. And for someone deeply attached to approval, that uncertainty feels terrifying. But Buddhism teaches that certainty itself is often an illusion. Human perception constantly changes. Opinions change, emotions change, narratives change. Trying to control all of them is like trying to control the movement of clouds in the sky. The calmer path is learning to remain grounded even when misunderstanding exists. This takes emotional discipline, because the ego constantly wants to protect itself. It wants to correct every false image. It wants reassurance that you are seen correctly. It wants emotional permission to relax. But true peace begins when you stop negotiating your worth through endless explanation. One of the deepest forms of maturity is realizing that your inner truth remains valid even when others fail to recognize it. That is difficult for many people because they were taught to build identity through external reflection. They learned to see themselves through approval, praise, validation, or emotional agreement. So when misunderstanding happens, it feels like identity itself is under attack. But Buddhist wisdom gently reminds us that identity built on external perception will always remain unstable, because the external world constantly shifts. One moment people praise you, another moment they criticize you, one moment they understand you, another moment they completely misread your intentions. If your emotional state rises and falls with every perception around you, the mind can never truly rest. This is why detachment becomes so powerful. Detachment does not mean becoming emotionless. It means no longer allowing your emotional survival to depend on controlling every outcome, especially outcomes that exist inside other people's minds. You begin to understand that people will interpret you according to their own level of awareness, wounds, fears, and experiences. And many times their perception says more about their inner world than it says about you. This realization frees enormous emotional energy. Suddenly, the mind no longer needs to replay every conversation 10,000 times. It no longer needs to search endlessly for the perfect wording. It no longer feels responsible for emotionally managing everybody's understanding. And slowly, the nervous system begins to rest. This is why some of the calmest people in the world are not necessarily those who are most understood. They are simply people who no longer require universal understanding in order to remain at peace. They speak honestly, they act sincerely, they clarify when necessary, but they no longer abandon their inner stability trying to force acceptance from everyone around them. That is real freedom. Because the truth is, no explanation will ever fully protect you from misunderstanding. Human beings see life through filters shaped by memory, trauma, ego, insecurity, culture, emotion, and personal desire. Two people can witness the exact same event and create completely different stories about it. Once you deeply understand this, something inside begins to let go. The endless mental courtroom starts disappearing. The emotional rehearsals become less frequent. The need to defend every detail weakens. And in that silence, a different kind of strength appears. A quieter strength. A calmer strength. The kind of strength that no longer needs to convince everyone in order to feel worthy. This is the beginning of inner peace. Not because the world suddenly understands you perfectly, but because you finally stop making your peace dependent on that happening. And once you begin to see that your peace cannot depend on everyone understanding you, another hidden pattern becomes easier to notice. The mind does not only suffer while you are explaining yourself, it also suffers long after the explanation is over. That is why an argument can end at noon, but still be alive in your head at midnight. The person may have walked away. The room may be quiet. Your phone may be silent. But inside, the conversation is still breathing, still moving, still cutting into places you thought had already healed. There is a strange pain in realizing that the argument ended outside you, but continued inside you. Your mouth stopped speaking, but your mind did not. Your body left the situation, but your thoughts stayed behind, searching through every word, every pause, every tone, every look, trying to find the exact moment where everything went wrong. This is why the mind replays arguments that already ended. It is not because you are weak. It is not because you love drama. It is because something inside you is still waiting for validation that never arrived. The mind says, if I can understand what happened, maybe I can feel calm. Then it says, if I can find the perfect response, maybe I can feel powerful again. Then it says, if I can prove I was right, maybe the pain will finally stop. But the pain does not stop that way, because the mind is trying to solve an emotional wound with mental repetition. Buddhism teaches that suffering grows when the mind clings. And sometimes what you cling to is not a person. It is not a place. It is not even the argument itself. Sometimes you are clinging to the version of the argument where you finally win, where they finally understand, where they finally say, you were right, I see what I did, I understand your pain. That is the invisible hook. You are not replaying the argument because the words matter so much. You are replaying it because your heart is still hoping for a different ending. This is why old conversations can feel more powerful than present moments. You may be eating, walking, resting, or trying to sleep, but suddenly your mind pulls you back into a scene that already passed. You remember what they said, then you remember what you should have said, then you create a better answer, then you imagine their reaction, then you return to the beginning and start again. The mind becomes a small theater where the same painful scene keeps being performed for an audience of one. And the saddest part is that every replay feels useful at first. It feels like thinking is helping. It feels like you are getting closer to peace. But most of the time you are not moving toward peace. You are only reopening the wound and calling it understanding. There is a difference between reflection and rumination. Reflection brings wisdom. Rumination brings exhaustion. Reflection asks, what can I learn from this? Rumination asks, how can I mentally survive this again and again until it finally feels different? That is why one gives you clarity and the other steals your rest. When the mind keeps replaying an argument, it is often trying to protect you from feeling powerless. During conflict, many people freeze. They cannot find the right words. They become overwhelmed. They say too little, too much, or nothing at all. Then later, when the body feels safer, the mind tries to return to the scene and repair the lost power. It says, "This time I will say it properly. This time I will defend myself. This time I will not let them misunderstand me." But the moment is already gone. The person is no longer there. The past cannot be edited. So the mind creates an imaginary version of the past and tries to fix it there. This gives a short feeling of control, but it also keeps you trapped. Buddhist wisdom reminds us that the past is not alive by itself. It is kept alive by attention. Every time you return to the argument with emotional attachment, you feed it. Every time you rehearse the pain, you strengthen the mental path back to it. Every time you search for the perfect sentence you should have said, you teach your nervous system that the danger is still happening. This is why the body can feel tense even when nothing is happening anymore. The heart beats faster, the stomach tightens, the jaw locks, the chest feels heavy. Not because the argument is still real in the outside world, but because the mind has brought the body back into it. The body does not always know the difference between what is happening and what is being vividly replayed. So when your mind returns to the argument, your body often returns too. This is why you can feel drained after doing nothing but thinking. You may tell yourself, "I have just been lying here." But inside, you have been fighting invisible battles for hours. You have been defending yourself against memories. You have been arguing with people who are not in the room. You have been trying to win peace from a scene that cannot answer you back. And that kind of thinking is not rest. It is emotional labor. The deeper reason the mind replays arguments is because conflict often touches identity. It is rarely only about the words spoken. It is about what those words seem to mean. When someone dismisses you, the mind may hear, "You do not matter." When someone judges you, the mind may hear, "You are not good enough." When someone misunderstands you, the mind may hear, "Your truth is not safe here." So the argument becomes bigger than the argument. It becomes a threat to your sense of worth. This is where attachment to validation becomes dangerous. If you need the other person to confirm your goodness before you can feel good, their silence becomes torture. If you need them to admit they hurt you before you can heal, their denial becomes a prison. If you need them to understand your intention before you can rest, their misunderstanding becomes the owner of your mind. Buddhism does not teach that your pain is fake. It does not tell you to pretend you were not hurt. It does not ask you to become numb. It asks you to look clearly at the second layer of suffering. The first pain is what happened. The second pain is the mind's attachment to needing it to be different. The first pain may be unavoidable. The second pain is where freedom begins. Someone may have spoken harshly. That is painful. Someone may have misunderstood you. That is painful. Someone may have refused to listen. That is painful. But when the mind keeps saying, "They must understand, they must apologize, they must see my side, they must give me closure," suffering deepens. Because now your peace is being held hostage by another person's awareness. And some people do not have the awareness to give you what you are waiting for. This is a hard truth, but it is a freeing one. Some people cannot validate your pain because they would have to face their own behavior. Some cannot understand you because understanding you would disturb the story they tell about themselves. Some cannot apologize because their ego is too fragile. Some cannot listen because they are still trapped inside their own wounds. So when your mind keeps replaying the argument, hoping to finally receive emotional justice from them, you may be waiting at a door that was never built to open. That is why Buddhist detachment is not weakness. It is not letting people get away with everything. It is refusing to keep drinking poison from an empty cup. Detachment says, "I can learn from this without living inside it." It says, I can feel pain without becoming loyal to the pain. It says, I can accept that someone did not understand me without spending my whole life trying to force their mind open. This is not easy because the ego loves unfinished battles. The ego wants victory. It wants the last word. It wants the perfect comeback. It wants to be seen as innocent, wise, kind, and correct. And when it does not get that, it keeps searching for a way to restore its image. But peace does not come from giving the ego everything it demands. Peace comes from seeing the ego clearly and no longer obeying every noise it makes. When an argument keeps replaying, pause and ask yourself gently, what am I still trying to get from this memory? Am I trying to get an apology? Am I trying to get control? Am I trying to prove I was right? Am I trying to feel safe? Am I trying to make the past give me a different ending? That question can open a door inside you, because the replay is usually not random. It is pointing to an unmet emotional need. Maybe you needed respect. Maybe you needed tenderness. Maybe you needed to be heard. Maybe you needed someone to say, your feelings make sense. But here is where deep healing begins. You can recognize the need without continuing the replay. You can say, I needed understanding, without forcing your mind to relive the argument all night. You can say, that hurt me, without building a home inside the hurt. You can say, I deserved better, without spending your life mentally debating someone who was never ready to meet you with maturity. The mind replays because it wants completion. But completion does not always come from the other person. Sometimes completion comes from your own clear seeing. It comes when you stop asking the past to comfort you. It comes when you stop expecting the person who hurt you to become the person who heals you. It comes when you finally say, even without their validation, I know what I felt. I know what happened inside me. I know what I need to learn. And I do not have to keep reopening this wound to prove it was real. That is a powerful moment, because many people secretly believe their pain only matters if someone else confirms it. They feel they cannot move on until the other person admits the damage. But Buddhist wisdom teaches that awareness does not require permission. Your pain does not become real only when another person agrees with it. You can honor your experience without turning it into a mental prison. There is also another reason arguments replay. The mind hates uncertainty. It wants clean answers. It wants to know who was right, who was wrong, what they meant, what you should have said, what will happen next, and whether the relationship is safe. But many conflicts do not offer clean answers. People are complicated, emotions are messy, words carry different meanings. Sometimes both people are hurt. Sometimes no one is fully innocent. Sometimes closure is not a sentence someone gives you. It is a decision you grow into. The restless mind struggles with this. It keeps searching for the final explanation that will make everything neat. But life is not always neat. Human relationships are not always neat, and if you wait for every emotional story to become perfectly clear before you rest, you may never rest at all. Buddhist practice invites you to sit with uncertainty without becoming controlled by it. This means you may not know exactly why they said what they said. You may not know whether they will ever understand. You may not know if they regret it. You may not know if they told the story differently to others. And still, you can breathe. Still, you can return to yourself. Still, you can choose not to let unanswered questions eat your inner life. This is not passive, it is deeply disciplined, because the mind will try to pull you back. It will say, think about it one more time. It will say, maybe you missed something. It will say, maybe if you replay it again, you will finally feel better. But if replaying it has not brought peace after the 100th time, why would the 101st time be different? At some point, wisdom must interrupt the loop, not with anger, not with force, but with gentle firmness. You can tell your mind, I know you are trying to protect me, but we are not going back there right now. This matters because many people hate their overthinking. They attack themselves for replaying arguments. They say, why am I like this? Why can't I just let it go? But self-attack only creates another layer of suffering. The mind that replays pain is often a mind that learned to survive by staying alert. It is not your enemy. It is an exhausted protector that does not yet know the danger has passed. So healing begins with compassion. You do not shame the mind into peace. You guide it there. You notice the replay. You breathe. You return to the body. You remind yourself, this is a memory, not the moment. This is a thought, not a command. This is pain asking for care, not proof that I must keep thinking. That simple awareness begins to create distance, and distance is powerful. When there is no distance, you are inside the argument again. When there is distance, you can see the argument as a mental event. You can watch the thought arise, stay for a while, and pass. This is one of the deepest gifts of Buddhist mindfulness. It teaches you that you are not every thought that appears. You are the awareness that can observe the thought. A replay may arise, but you do not have to enter it. A memory may knock, but you do not have to open the door. A sentence may return, but you do not have to build a whole conversation around it. This is how freedom begins in small moments, not by erasing the memory, but by changing your relationship with it. You may still remember what happened, but the memory no longer owns your nervous system. You may still feel sadness, but sadness no longer turns into hours of mental argument. You may still wish things happened differently, but that wish no longer pulls you out of the present. This is the difference between healing and being trapped. Healing does not mean you never think about the argument again. It means the thought can pass through you without taking your whole peace with it. Another important truth is that replaying arguments often creates false wisdom. The mind convinces you that because you have thought about something deeply, you understand it deeply. But sometimes repeated thinking does not create understanding. It creates distortion. The more you replay, the more the memory can change shape. You may begin to focus only on certain words. You may ignore other details. You may strengthen your anger. You may sharpen your pain. You may create new meanings that were not fully there. The mind can turn one painful moment into a whole identity if you keep feeding it. This is why Buddhism encourages direct awareness instead of endless storytelling. The story says, they disrespected me, they never cared, people always treat me this way, I should have known, I can never trust anyone. Awareness says, pain is here, anger is here, tightness is here, a desire to be understood is here. The story multiplies suffering. Awareness brings you back to what is real now. When you return to what is real now, the argument loses some of its power. You may notice your feet on the floor. You may feel the breath moving in your chest. You may hear sounds around you. You may realize that in this exact moment, nobody is arguing with you. The body is here, the room is here, life is still happening. The mind was in the past, but the present was waiting. This return to the present is not small. It is the heart of liberation, because suffering needs time to survive. It needs past and future. It needs memory and imagination. It says, remember what they did, and then, what if it happens again? But peace lives in direct contact with now. Right now you can breathe. Right now you can soften your shoulders. Right now you can stop giving your energy to a conversation that is no longer happening. Right now you can choose not to keep hurting yourself with someone else's words. This does not mean you ignore the lesson. If boundaries are needed, you create them. If a conversation must happen later, you prepare calmly. If someone repeatedly harms your peace, you step back. Buddhist peace is not about becoming a doormat. It is about acting from clarity instead of emotional compulsion. There is a big difference between responding wisely and reacting from replayed pain. When the mind has replayed an argument for hours, it often wants to act from pressure. It wants to send the long message. It wants to prove the point. It wants to reopen the conversation, not because it is the right time, but because the body wants relief. But relief is not always wisdom. Sometimes the message you want to send is not communication. It is anxiety looking for a place to land. Sometimes the explanation you want to give is not truth. It is fear trying to control the outcome. Sometimes the apology you want is not closure. It is your nervous system begging another person to calm you down. When you see this clearly, you become more careful with your energy. You learn to wait until the mind is quiet before you speak. You learn that not every emotional urge deserves immediate action. You learn that peace often begins in the pause. The pause is powerful because it breaks the chain. Thought arises, the old you follows it. Pain arises, the old you becomes it. Anger arises, the old you speaks from it. But with awareness, something new becomes possible. Thought arises and you notice it. Pain arises and you hold it gently. Anger arises and you do not let it drive. That is the beginning of mastery. Not control over other people. Control over your own return to yourself. The mind replays arguments because it wants to be saved from discomfort. But the path is not to escape discomfort. The path is to learn that discomfort can be felt without becoming a command. You can feel misunderstood without explaining. You can feel angry without attacking. You can feel hurt without reopening every wound. You can feel the urge to replay without obeying it. This is where freedom becomes real. Because the goal is not to have a life where no one ever hurts you, misunderstands you, or argues with you. That life does not exist. The goal is to become so rooted in awareness that painful moments no longer take complete control of your mind. A restless mind says, I need them to understand so I can be okay. A wiser mind says, I would like to be understood, but I will not abandon myself if I am not. That is a different level of peace. And when this peace grows, the replaying slowly loses strength. Not all at once, not magically, but gradually, like a fire dying because you stopped adding wood. The first time you may still replay the argument for hours, but you notice it sooner. The next time you may pause and breathe before entering the loop. Later, you may recognize the old pattern and choose not to feed it. Eventually, you may hear the memory call your name and you simply do not answer. That is healing. Not because the past changed, but because you changed your loyalty to it. You are no longer loyal to the wound. You are loyal to your peace. You are no longer loyal to the argument. You are loyal to your awareness. You are no longer loyal to proving yourself. You are loyal to returning home inside your own mind. And this is where the previous lesson becomes even deeper. Constantly explaining yourself drains your emotional energy, but constantly replaying arguments drains your spiritual energy. It keeps your life force trapped in moments that cannot nourish you. It keeps your heart tied to people who may not even be thinking about you. It keeps your present life paying interest on old pain. At some point, you must ask, how much of my life am I willing to spend inside conversations that already ended? That question can hurt, but it can also wake you up, because every hour spent replaying an old argument is an hour stolen from your real life, from your rest, from your creativity, from your prayer, from your healing, from the people who love you now, from the quiet beauty of being alive today. The argument may have taken one moment from you. Do not let the replay take your whole life. Buddhism teaches that the mind becomes peaceful not by winning every inner battle, but by seeing clearly which battles no longer need to be fought. Some arguments ended already. Some explanations were enough already. Some people showed you their limits already. Some wounds are asking for care, not another courtroom session in your head. Let the memory teach you, but do not let it own you. Let the pain soften you, but do not let it define you. Let the lesson remain, but let the argument end where it ended. And when the mind tries to pull you back tonight, gently remind it, we have already been there. We have already suffered there. We are choosing peace now. That sentence may not silence everything immediately, but it plants a new seed, a seed of inner authority, a seed of detachment, a seed of freedom. And with time, that seed grows into a mind that no longer needs to replay pain in order to feel protected, a heart that no longer waits for validation before it begins healing. A soul that understands the past may still speak, but it no longer gets to rule. This is the quiet strength Buddhist teachings point us toward. Not a life without conflict, but a mind that knows how to return to stillness after conflict. Not a heart that never hurts, but a heart that no longer keeps hurting itself with memories. Not a person who is always understood, but a person who no longer needs every argument to end with validation before they can finally rest. And slowly, this is where the mind begins to discover something most people spend their entire lives resisting. Peace does not come from finally making everybody understand you. Peace begins the moment you stop making your emotional stability depend on their understanding. Because the truth is, some people will walk away with the wrong version of you in their mind. Some will misunderstand your silence. Some will misunderstand your kindness. Some will misunderstand your boundaries. Some will misunderstand your pain, and no amount of explaining will fully control the story they choose to believe. At first, this feels unbearable, but hidden inside this discomfort is one of the rarest freedoms a human being can ever discover. There is a deep loneliness that appears when you realize people may never fully see your heart the way you hoped they would. It hurts because human beings naturally want to feel known. They want to feel emotionally understood. They want someone to look beyond the surface and say, I understand why you are the way you are. But life does not always give that gift. Sometimes you explain yourself carefully, honestly, patiently, and still leave the conversation feeling unseen. Sometimes you tell the truth, and people still create their own version of you. Sometimes your intentions are pure, but someone else's pain, ego, fear, or assumptions distort everything you meant. And this is where many minds become trapped. They spend years trying to correct every misunderstanding, terrified that being seen incorrectly means losing love, respect, safety, or worth. So they constantly monitor people's reactions, they replay conversations, they over-explain their actions, they defend their character, they chase clarity the way thirsty people chase water. But the more desperately you chase understanding, the more emotionally imprisoned you become. Buddhism teaches that suffering often grows from attachment to things we cannot fully control. And one of the hardest things for the ego to accept is this: you cannot completely control how other people perceive you. No matter how truthful you are, people will still interpret you through their own wounds. A suspicious person may see manipulation where there was honesty. An insecure person may see rejection where there was distance. A wounded person may see attack where there was correction. A selfish person may see boundaries as cruelty. And a person committed to misunderstanding, you will often twist even your kindness into something harmful. This realization can feel painful at first because the ego wants fairness. It wants reality to reward sincerity with understanding. It wants good intentions to automatically create good perceptions. But human beings do not work that way. People do not see you as you are. They see you as they are. This is one of the most freeing truths you can ever understand. Many people waste enormous emotional energy trying to enter other people's minds and rearrange the way they are perceived there. They want to fix every wrong assumption, every false story, every unfair opinion. But the more they try, the more exhausted they become. Because controlling perception is a battle with no ending. There will always be another misunderstanding, another assumption, another criticism, another person who projects their own fears onto you. And if your peace depends on correcting all of them, your peace will never arrive. This is why some people feel mentally tired even during calm seasons of life. They are constantly managing invisible emotional narratives. Their mind never rests because it is always trying to protect an image. Buddhist wisdom invites you into something radically different. Instead of controlling every perception, you learn to anchor yourself in truth internally. You stop asking every person outside you to confirm what you already know inside. This does not mean becoming careless about how you treat people. It does not mean becoming arrogant or emotionally cold. It means learning the difference between living truthfully and living performatively. A performative life is exhausting because you are always acting for an audience. Every action becomes connected to how it will be interpreted. Every silence becomes dangerous. Every mistake becomes terrifying. Every misunderstanding becomes an emotional emergency. But a truthful life is different. In a truthful life, you still communicate honestly, but you no longer panic when someone misunderstands you. You still clarify when necessary, but you do not emotionally collapse when clarity fails. You still care about people, but you stop sacrificing your inner peace trying to control their minds. This is rare because most people are deeply addicted to approval without realizing it. Approval feels emotionally safe. Misunderstanding feels emotionally threatening. So the nervous system keeps trying to avoid misunderstanding at all costs. This often begins in childhood. Children who grew up around criticism, emotional unpredictability, rejection, or conditional love become hyper-aware of how others perceive them. They learn that safety comes from managing reactions carefully. They become experts at explaining, pleasing, softening, defending, and adjusting themselves. Over time, they stop asking, "What feels true to me?" and start asking, "How can I avoid being misunderstood?" That question quietly destroys authenticity, because eventually you begin living according to perception rather than truth. You choose words carefully, not because they are honest, but because they are safe. You suppress emotions, not because they are wrong, but because they may be judged. You shape your personality around avoiding rejection. You become emotionally dependent on being seen correctly, and this creates deep internal tension. Because no matter how carefully you manage yourself, people will still misunderstand you sometimes. That is unavoidable. So the mind stays anxious, always preparing, always correcting, always watching, always defending. This is why letting people misunderstand you feels terrifying at first. It feels like stepping outside without armor. The ego says, "If they misunderstand me, I will lose control, I will lose connection, I will lose safety." But something surprising happens when you stop fighting every misunderstanding. You begin to breathe differently. Your nervous system slowly realizes it does not have to stay on constant emotional guard. You stop carrying the impossible responsibility of managing everyone's perception of you. And for the first time in a long time, your inner world begins to feel spacious. Many people do not realize how much emotional energy they spend protecting their image. They wake up already thinking about how others see them. They carry conversations in their head. They rehearse explanations before interactions happen. They mentally defend themselves against criticism that may never even come. This is not peace. It is emotional survival mode. Buddhist teachings constantly point toward non-attachment because attachment creates fear. When you are attached to reputation, criticism feels deadly. When you are attached to approval, rejection feels unbearable. When you are attached to being understood, misunderstanding feels like emotional violence. But when attachment loosens, freedom enters. Not because the world changes, but because your relationship to the world changes. You stop needing universal agreement in order to remain calm. That changes everything internally. You begin realizing that some people are committed to misunderstanding you because it protects their own ego. If they truly understood you, they might have to question themselves. They might have to admit fault. They might have to see complexity instead of simple blame. And many people resist. Complexity because it threatens the stories they use to feel emotionally secure. This is why trying to force understanding often becomes self-destruction. You keep offering explanations to people who are emotionally unavailable to truth. You keep trying to open doors that were never willing to open. At some point, wisdom says, enough. Not from bitterness, not from hatred, but from clarity. Clarity says, I cannot force awareness into someone who refuses to see. This realization creates a painful but beautiful turning point. Instead of endlessly chasing understanding from others, you begin returning to understanding yourself. You begin asking different questions, not, how do I make them see me correctly, but, why am I abandoning my peace trying to control their perception? Not, how do I convince everyone of my intentions, but, why does my nervous system believe misunderstanding is dangerous? Not, how do I stop people from judging me? But, why have I given strangers so much power over my inner world? These questions begin transforming the mind. Because true freedom is not becoming universally liked. True freedom is becoming emotionally stable even when you are not. That is rare. Most people are emotionally controlled by perception. Praise lifts them. Criticism destroys them. Approval energizes them. Misunderstanding consumes them. Their inner state constantly depends on external reflection. But Buddhist practice teaches something quieter and far more powerful. It teaches the art of inner grounding. Inner grounding means your sense of self no longer changes every time someone misunderstands you. It means criticism may still hurt, but it no longer defines you. It means false assumptions may still appear, but they no longer steal your peace for weeks. It means you stop building your identity out of other people's temporary opinions. This matters deeply because opinions are unstable. Human beings constantly change their perception based on mood, memory, insecurity, fear, culture, projection, and emotional state. Someone may praise you one day and criticize you the next without you changing at all. If your worth depends on those shifting perceptions, your life becomes emotionally chaotic. This is why many people secretly feel exhausted around others. Social interaction becomes performance management. They are not simply living. They are constantly adjusting, explaining, monitoring, calculating, and protecting themselves emotionally. Eventually, they lose contact with who they really are beneath all the adaptation. And this is where letting people misunderstand you becomes sacred, because it forces you to stop performing for emotional survival. It forces you to tolerate uncertainty. It forces you to stop micromanaging every opinion. It forces you to discover whether you can still remain peaceful without universal approval. That is not weakness. That is emotional courage. The ego fears being misunderstood because the ego wants control. It wants certainty. It wants emotional safety through image protection. But true peace requires surrendering some control. Not control over your actions, not control over your values, but control over outcomes that never fully belong to you anyway. You cannot fully control what another person chooses to believe. You cannot fully control what story they tell themselves about you. You cannot fully control whether they understand your heart accurately, and trying to do so will slowly drain the life out of you. Many people spend years emotionally chasing people who already decided not to understand them. They keep explaining, keep defending, keep proving, keep hoping that one perfect conversation will finally create peace. But peace rarely arrives through emotional chasing. Peace arrives when chasing stops. This is why silence becomes powerful, not defensive silence, not passive-aggressive silence, but peaceful silence. The kind of silence that says, I no longer need to force understanding in order to remain connected to myself. That kind of silence heals the nervous system, because the nervous system finally learns that misunderstanding is uncomfortable but survivable. At first, this feels deeply unnatural. The mind keeps saying, explain yourself, correct them, defend your name. But over time, you begin noticing something surprising. Not every misunderstanding deserves your energy. Some people are not asking questions because they genuinely want understanding. They are asking questions because they want emotional control. Some are not listening to understand you. They are listening to confirm what they already believe. And no explanation can heal a mind committed to distortion. This does not mean you never speak up. Sometimes clarification matters. Sometimes truth must be spoken. Sometimes boundaries must be defended. But wisdom teaches discernment. You begin learning the difference between necessary communication and compulsive self-defense. Necessary communication feels calm, grounded, and clear. Compulsive self-defense feels anxious, urgent, and emotionally desperate. One comes from truth, the other comes from fear. This difference is important because many people believe they are communicating when they are actually begging for emotional permission to relax. They think, if I can just make them understand me, then I can finally feel okay. But this creates emotional slavery. Your nervous system becomes dependent on external agreement before it allows itself peace. That is a terrible burden to carry, because people are inconsistent. Some misunderstand accidentally, some misunderstand intentionally, some misunderstand because they only hear through their own pain, and some misunderstand because accepting the truth would require maturity they have not yet developed. When you stop expecting every person to understand you perfectly, you stop placing impossible emotional demands on life. And strangely, relationships often become healthier after this. Why? Because you stop interacting from desperation. You stop trying to manipulate people into validating you emotionally. You stop over-explaining every feeling. You stop monitoring every tiny shift in perception. You become more present, more relaxed, more authentic, more honest. You stop speaking from panic and start speaking from grounded clarity. This changes your entire energy. People can feel when someone is emotionally begging to be understood. There is tension in it, fear in it, attachment in it. But there is also a quiet confidence in people who no longer need to force perception. They speak honestly, then release the outcome. That release is powerful because most emotional suffering comes from gripping too tightly, gripping reputation, gripping image, gripping approval, gripping emotional control. Buddhist wisdom constantly reminds us that gripping creates suffering because life itself is fluid. Perception changes, relationships change, opinions change, human understanding changes. When you stop gripping, the mind softens, and something beautiful begins happening internally. You start spending less time inside imaginary conversations. You stop rehearsing explanations before bed. You stop mentally defending yourself against every criticism. You stop replaying every social interaction, searching for signs of rejection. Your energy returns to you. This is one of the hidden gifts of detachment. It restores stolen energy. For years, many people leak emotional energy trying to manage perception. They are exhausted without understanding why. But once they stop carrying the impossible burden of universal understanding, they suddenly feel lighter. They laugh more easily, sleep more deeply, think more clearly, speak more honestly, because the mind is no longer constantly scanning for emotional danger. This is why letting people misunderstand you is not passive. It is deeply active spiritual work. You are retraining the nervous system. You are teaching yourself that peace does not require constant defense. You are teaching the ego that misunderstanding is not death. You are teaching your heart that your worth remains intact even when someone sees you incorrectly. That lesson changes everything, because eventually you stop asking, "How do I make everyone understand me?" And you begin asking, "How do I remain connected to peace even when they do not?" That question leads somewhere far deeper. It leads inward. And inward is where freedom has always been waiting. Most people search for peace through control. They think peace will arrive once everybody approves, agrees, understands, and validates them. But that kind of peace is fragile because it depends entirely on external conditions. Real peace is different. Real peace remains even when misunderstanding exists. Real peace remains even when someone dislikes you unfairly. Real peace remains even when your intentions are misread. Real peace remains even when you are judged by people who never took the time to know your heart. This is not because pain disappears completely. It is because your identity is no longer built on external perception. You know who you are privately. You know your intentions honestly. You know your values internally. And that becomes enough. This is one of the rarest forms of emotional maturity. Not needing every room to agree with you before you feel whole. Not needing every person to validate your pain before you allow yourself healing. Not needing every misunderstanding corrected before you permit yourself rest. This maturity creates tremendous emotional freedom because you stop fighting unwinnable battles. You stop trying to climb inside every mind and rearrange every opinion. You stop carrying emotional responsibility for narratives you cannot control. And most importantly, you stop abandoning yourself in pursuit of acceptance. That abandonment is what hurts most people deeply. They betray their own peace trying to maintain connection. They silence themselves trying to maintain approval. They over-explain themselves trying to maintain understanding. And slowly, they lose themselves. Buddhist teachings invite you back home. Back to stillness. Back to awareness. Back to the quiet truth beneath all the noise. You do not need to spend your life defending your soul against every misunderstanding. You do not need to turn every false assumption into an emotional emergency. You do not need to keep proving your heart to people determined not to see it. At some point, freedom begins with a quiet sentence inside yourself. Let them misunderstand. Not with anger, not with resentment, but with peace. Because your life is too precious to spend entirely inside other people's opinions. And once you truly understand this, something inside you finally unclenches. The nervous system relaxes, the mind becomes quieter, the heart stops chasing. You stop trying to force emotional certainty from a world that cannot consistently provide it. And in that release, you discover something unexpected. The less desperately you need to control perception, the more authentically you begin to live. You speak more truthfully because fear loses power. You love more openly because approval matters less. You rest more deeply because the mind no longer spends every night defending itself. This is the rare freedom most people never experience. The freedom of no longer needing everyone to understand you before you allow yourself peace. And once this freedom enters your life, you begin realizing how much suffering was created not by misunderstanding itself, but by resistance to misunderstanding. The world may still judge, people may still assume, some may still leave with incomplete versions of you in their minds, but your soul no longer follows them begging to be explained. It stays with you, calm, grounded, whole. And that is where true inner peace begins. And this is where the deeper truth slowly begins to reveal itself. The desperate need to be understood did not appear overnight. It did not begin with one argument, one rejection, or one misunderstanding in adulthood. For many people, the hunger to be emotionally seen began much earlier, in places they rarely revisit consciously, because sometimes the adult who over-explains everything is simply the child who once felt invisible. There is a certain kind of pain that does not come from being physically abandoned. It comes from being emotionally unseen for so long that you slowly begin believing your feelings only matter if you can explain them perfectly. Some wounds are loud and obvious, others are quiet. They hide inside personality traits people often praise, being overly understanding, over-explaining, becoming hyper-aware of other people's emotions, constantly needing reassurance, feeling terrified of misunderstanding, trying desperately to make everyone see your intentions clearly. Many people think these behaviors are simply sensitivity, but underneath them, there is often a child who spent years emotionally reaching for connection and rarely feeling fully met. Childhood emotional neglect is difficult to recognize because it does not always look dramatic from the outside. Sometimes there was food, shelter, education, laughter, and family photos. Sometimes nobody screamed, nobody hit, nobody left. Yet something essential was still missing: emotional attunement. The feeling that your inner world mattered. The feeling that someone truly saw your emotions instead of dismissing, minimizing, ignoring, or rushing past them. A child may cry and hear, "Stop being dramatic." A child may feel hurt and hear, "You're too sensitive." A child may try to express fear and hear, "You have nothing to be upset about." A child may try to explain pain and be interrupted, mocked, ignored, or emotionally abandoned. Over time, the child learns something dangerous. My feelings are not automatically important. So they begin trying harder, explaining more, defending more, proving more, searching more desperately for emotional recognition. And eventually, this becomes part of their identity. This is why some adults feel unbearable emotional panic when they are misunderstood. It is not only about the present moment. The misunderstanding touches an older wound. A wound that says, "Nobody ever truly listened to me." A wound that says, "I must work very hard to earn." Emotional understanding. The nervous system remembers emotional neglect long after the conscious mind forgets it. This is important to understand because many people blame themselves for being emotionally exhausted. They ask, "Why do I care so much what people think? Why do misunderstandings destroy me emotionally? Why can't I stop over-explaining myself?" But beneath those behaviors is often a survival strategy formed very early in life. A child who feels emotionally unseen learns to chase recognition like oxygen. That child grows into an adult who unconsciously believes peace comes through finally being understood. This creates deep emotional hunger. Not ordinary attention, not ordinary validation, but the painful craving for someone to finally say, "I see you clearly, your emotions make sense, your pain is real, your inner world matters." And because this hunger is so deep, many adults spend their lives searching for emotionally corrective experiences in relationships, friendships, work environments, and even strangers. They hope that if enough people understand them now, the old emptiness will finally disappear. But emotional neglect creates a wound that external understanding alone cannot fully heal, because the wound was never only about other people failing to understand you. The wound was also about learning to abandon yourself emotionally in order to survive. Many emotionally neglected children become highly skilled at reading other people. They become emotionally observant because safety depended on predicting moods, reactions, or emotional shifts around them. They learned to focus outward constantly. But they were rarely taught how to stay connected inward, So, as adults, they often know exactly how others feel while feeling disconnected from their own emotional needs. This creates exhausting relationships. They become caretakers, over-explainers, people-pleasers, emotional managers. They constantly try to maintain harmony because conflict unconsciously reminds them of emotional disconnection from childhood. Even small misunderstandings can trigger enormous internal fear because the nervous system interprets disconnection as danger. This is why some people feel physically anxious after tension with someone they care about. Their stomach tightens, their chest feels heavy, their thoughts race uncontrollably. They cannot sleep peacefully until the emotional distance feels repaired. What they often do not realize is that their body is reacting not only to the present conflict, but to old emotional memories stored beneath awareness. The child inside them once learned that emotional disconnection felt unbearable, so the adult becomes obsessed with restoring emotional understanding quickly. This explains why emotionally neglected people often over-explain themselves during conflict. They are not simply communicating facts. They are unconsciously trying to preserve emotional connection. They believe if they can just explain their intentions perfectly, they will finally feel safe again. But safety built on external understanding is fragile, because human beings misunderstand each other constantly. No explanation can guarantee emotional certainty forever, and this keeps the nervous system trapped in exhaustion. Buddhist teachings become deeply important here because Buddhism teaches awareness without attachment. It teaches compassionate observation of suffering rather than complete identification with it. Instead of saying, "I am broken because I need validation," awareness gently says, "There is pain here. There is unmet longing here. There is an old hunger for emotional recognition here." This changes everything internally, because healing begins the moment you stop attacking yourself for the survival patterns you developed in order to emotionally survive childhood. Many emotionally neglected adults secretly carry shame about their emotional needs. They believe needing understanding makes them weak, needy, dramatic, or difficult. But the truth is much softer than that. Every child needs emotional recognition. Every child needs to feel emotionally safe enough to express sadness, fear, confusion, joy, anger, and vulnerability without constantly feeling dismissed or punished. When that emotional safety is missing, the nervous system adapts. Some children become emotionally silent. Some become perfectionists. Some become hyper-independent. Some become emotionally numb. And some become obsessed with finally being understood. None of these responses mean the child was weak. They mean the child was trying to survive emotionally. This is why healing requires compassion, not self-hatred. The adult mind often says, "Why am I still like this?" But the deeper truth is that part of you never learned what emotional safety feels like. So now the mind constantly searches for it externally. You search for it in conversations, in reassurance, in emotional closeness, in explanations, in approval, in being seen correctly. But external validation cannot permanently calm a nervous system carrying old emotional neglect. Because the nervous system does not only need understanding from others, it also needs reconnection with itself. This is where Buddhist awareness becomes transformative. Awareness teaches you to sit gently with your emotions instead of constantly trying to escape them through external confirmation. Instead of rushing to make others understand your pain, you begin learning how to stay present with the pain yourself. That sounds simple, but for emotionally neglected people, it feels deeply unfamiliar. Because many grew up learning that emotions were problems to suppress, justify, minimize, or explain away. Very few were taught how to simply feel safely. So adulthood becomes a constant attempt to regulate internally through external reactions. If people approve, they feel temporarily calm. If people misunderstand them, they feel emotionally unsafe again. This creates emotional dependency without them realizing it. The mind becomes addicted to reassurance because reassurance temporarily fills an old emotional emptiness. But temporary relief is not healing. It only calms the wound for a moment before the hunger returns. This is why some people feel emotionally exhausted after social interaction. They are not only interacting, they are unconsciously scanning for emotional confirmation constantly. Did they understand me? Did I say something wrong? Do they still like me? Did I upset them? Should I explain myself more? Are they pulling away? The nervous system remains hyper-alert because childhood emotional neglect trained the mind to constantly monitor emotional connection for signs of danger. This hypervigilance becomes exhausting, and sadly, many people spend years blaming themselves instead of recognizing the deeper root. They call themselves too emotional, too sensitive, too needy, too anxious, but often they are simply emotionally undernourished. A person starved emotionally for years will naturally crave emotional recognition intensely later in life. That craving makes sense. But Buddhism gently teaches that clinging to validation will never fully heal the wound either, because no amount of external understanding can completely repair a nervous system that still believes love must be earned through emotional performance. This is why healing requires learning something entirely new. You begin learning how to emotionally stay with yourself, not abandon yourself, not silence yourself, not shame yourself, not constantly run toward external reassurance, but stay present, aware, compassionate. This can feel uncomfortable initially because emotionally neglected people often feel safest when focused outward. Focusing inward may awaken sadness they buried for years. Suddenly, they begin realizing how lonely childhood actually felt, how often they felt emotionally dismissed, how many times they needed comfort and received correction instead, how many emotions they swallowed to avoid becoming a burden, how often they adapted themselves emotionally just to maintain connection. These realizations can feel heartbreaking, but they are also freeing because clarity ends confusion. For years, many adults think their obsession with being understood is random weakness. They do not realize it has roots, deep roots, roots connected to emotional invisibility, roots connected to not feeling emotionally held, roots connected to constantly needing to explain feelings that should have been naturally welcomed and acknowledged. When a child repeatedly feels emotionally unseen, they unconsciously begin building identity around earning recognition. I must explain myself perfectly. I must prove my feelings. I must avoid upsetting others. I must manage how people see me. I must become easy to love. These beliefs become invisible rules guiding adult behavior. And because they are unconscious, people rarely question them. They simply continue living inside them. This is why emotionally neglected adults often become deeply afraid of conflict. Conflict does not feel like a simple disagreement. It feels like possible emotional abandonment. Misunderstanding feels like disconnection. Disconnection feels dangerous. So the nervous system desperately tries to repair everything immediately. This creates compulsive explaining, apologizing, reassuring, fixing, and emotional overfunctioning. But constantly earning emotional safety is exhausting. At some point, healing asks a difficult question. What if you no longer had to perform emotionally in order to deserve connection? That question changes everything. Because emotionally neglected people often believe love is conditional on emotional usefulness. They learn to become emotionally convenient for others. Easy, understanding, low maintenance, helpful, calm, accommodating. And when they finally express pain, they often feel guilt afterward. Why? Because childhood taught them their emotions were inconvenient. This is why many adults explain their feelings excessively. They unconsciously feel they must justify having emotions at all. They fear being seen as irrational, dramatic, selfish, difficult, or needy. So they over-explain every emotional reaction, trying to make their feelings acceptable enough to receive care. But true emotional safety does not require endless justification. Healthy connection allows emotions to exist without requiring a courtroom defense. This realization can feel revolutionary for emotionally neglected adults, because many have never experienced relationships where their emotions were simply allowed to exist peacefully, without interrogation, without minimization, without emotional punishment, without withdrawal, without shame. This is why emotionally neglected people often feel deeply attached to rare moments of emotional understanding. When someone finally listens gently, validates their feelings, or sees their inner world clearly, it can feel overwhelming. Not because they are weak, but because emotionally seen moments were rare throughout development. The nervous system reacts intensely to emotional nourishment after years of emotional starvation. This also explains why some adults become deeply attached to emotionally validating relationships very quickly. They are not only attached to the person, they are attached to the feeling of finally being emotionally visible, and that can become dangerous if awareness is missing. Because emotionally neglected people may tolerate unhealthy relationships simply because the person occasionally provides emotional recognition. The hunger to feel seen becomes stronger than discernment. This is why Buddhist detachment matters so deeply. Detachment does not mean rejecting love or connection. It means no longer depending entirely on external emotional validation to feel whole internally. You can appreciate understanding without becoming emotionally enslaved to it. That distinction matters enormously, because many emotionally neglected adults unconsciously hand their emotional stability to others. Their peace depends on reassurance. Their worth depends on attention. Their calm depends on approval. This creates tremendous suffering because human beings are inconsistent. Some days people understand you beautifully, other days they fail completely. If your nervous system depends entirely on external emotional consistency, life will always feel unstable. Healing begins when you slowly learn to become emotionally present for yourself. This does not happen instantly. At first, sitting alone with emotions may feel uncomfortable. The mind immediately wants external soothing. Text someone, explain yourself, seek reassurance, gain validation, fix perception. But slowly, awareness teaches another possibility. You can remain with your own emotional experience compassionately without immediately escaping yourself. That is powerful. Because emotionally neglected children often learn to disconnect from themselves internally. Healing reconnects them. You begin noticing your emotions earlier instead of suppressing them. You begin honoring your needs instead of minimizing them. You begin speaking honestly instead of shape-shifting emotionally for acceptance. You begin realizing your feelings deserve compassion even when nobody else fully understands them. This changes your relationship with misunderstanding itself. Because now misunderstanding no longer automatically means emotional abandonment. You begin developing internal grounding, a quieter sense of self, a calmer nervous system. You still appreciate emotional connection, but you no longer panic when someone fails to fully understand you. That panic slowly softens because the abandoned child inside you finally begins experiencing something new. Presence, gentleness, emotional safety within yourself. This is one of the deepest forms of healing, not becoming emotionally independent in a cold way, but becoming emotionally rooted enough that misunderstanding no longer destroys your inner world completely. Buddhist teachings remind us constantly that attachment creates suffering. Emotional neglect often creates enormous attachment to recognition because recognition once felt emotionally necessary for survival. But survival is not the same as peace. Survival says, make them understand me so I can feel safe. Healing says, I can survive misunderstanding without abandoning myself. That shift changes everything. The mind becomes quieter. The compulsive need to explain weakens. The desperate search for validation softens. And slowly, you begin realizing something beautiful. Your emotions were never the burden. Your humanity was never the problem. Your need for emotional connection was never weakness. The real pain came from growing up in environments that did not know how to hold emotional truth gently. Once you understand this deeply, self-hatred begins dissolving. You stop attacking yourself for your sensitivity. You stop mocking yourself for caring deeply. You stop feeling ashamed of your emotional needs, and instead, you begin offering yourself what was missing long ago: patience, understanding, presence, compassion. This does not erase the past instantly. Emotional neglect leaves traces inside the nervous system. Certain misunderstandings may still hurt deeply. Certain rejections may still awaken old fears. Certain conflicts may still trigger emotional panic. But awareness changes your relationship with these reactions. Instead of drowning inside them, you begin observing them compassionately. You say, this feeling is old. This fear began long ago. My nervous system learned this response for survival. That child inside me is afraid of being unseen again. This awareness creates space, and inside that space, healing becomes possible. Because you are no longer unconsciously living from the wound alone, you are beginning to witness it consciously. That witnessing is sacred. It allows the adult version of you to finally meet the abandoned emotional child inside with kindness instead of criticism. And many people cry when they first experience this awareness deeply because they finally realize something heartbreaking. They spent years begging others to emotionally rescue pain they never learned to sit with themselves, not because they failed, but because nobody taught them how. Buddhist wisdom gently reminds us that awareness itself is healing. The moment suffering becomes conscious, transformation begins, not immediate perfection, not instant peace, but gradual liberation. Little by little, you stop chasing emotional recognition compulsively. Little by little, you stop explaining your humanity endlessly. Little by little, you stop treating misunderstanding like proof of worthlessness. And eventually, something extraordinary begins happening. You stop searching for one person to finally heal the emptiness completely. Instead, you begin building emotional safety inside yourself, slowly, patiently, compassionately. This changes every relationship in your life, because now you are no longer entering relationships starving for emotional rescue. You are entering them with awareness, with grounding, with emotional honesty. You still value understanding deeply, but you no longer collapse without it. That is maturity. That is healing. And that is where true peace quietly begins. Not when every person finally understands your heart perfectly, but when the abandoned child inside you no longer has to beg the world constantly to prove they deserve to be emotionally seen. And this is where many people finally begin to notice something they have been running from their entire lives. The pain was never only about being misunderstood. The pain was also about what happened inside them when no reassurance came afterward. Because for some people, silence does not feel neutral. Silence feels dangerous. A message goes unanswered, and the mind immediately begins searching for meaning. A conversation ends without reassurance, and anxiety quietly enters the body. Someone becomes emotionally distant, quieter than usual, less expressive than before, and suddenly the nervous system feels restless, unsettled, unable to relax. Most people think they are afraid of rejection, but often they are even more afraid of silence. because silence leaves them alone with their own unresolved fears. There is a kind of silence that feels heavier than words. It enters quietly. No argument, no explanation, no reassurance, no emotional confirmation, just emptiness where validation used to be. And for people who built emotional safety around reassurance, that silence can feel unbearable. The room becomes quiet, but the mind becomes louder. Suddenly thoughts begin racing. Did I do something wrong? Are they upset with me? Do they still care? Did I say too much? Why are they acting differently? The silence itself becomes emotionally interpreted as danger. This is because many people were never taught how to feel emotionally safe without external confirmation. Their nervous system learned to relax only when reassurance was present. Praise meant safety. Attention meant connection. Validation meant emotional survival. So when silence appears, the body reacts as if connection itself is disappearing. This reaction is far deeper than simple insecurity. It is often rooted in emotional conditioning that began very early in life. A child who grows up in emotionally unpredictable environments becomes highly sensitive to emotional absence. If love, attention, or warmth were inconsistent, the child learns to monitor emotional signals constantly. They become emotionally alert, hyper-aware, sensitive to tone shifts, sensitive to facial expressions, sensitive to silence, because silence once carried emotional consequences. Sometimes silence meant punishment. Sometimes silence meant withdrawal. Sometimes silence meant disappointment. Sometimes silence meant emotional abandonment. So the nervous system learned something important very early. Silence is not safe. That lesson stays inside the body long after childhood ends. This is why certain adults panic when people become quiet around them. Their reaction is not only about the present moment. Silence awakens old emotional memories stored beneath awareness. The adult mind may say, "It's probably nothing," but the nervous system says, "Something is wrong. Fix it immediately." This creates compulsive emotional behaviors. Over-texting, over-explaining, seeking reassurance, people-pleasing, trying to emotionally repair situations that may not even be damaged. The silence becomes intolerable because it removes external emotional certainty. And for people deeply attached to validation, uncertainty feels emotionally threatening. Buddhism teaches that attachment creates suffering because attachment creates dependency. When your emotional peace depends on external reassurance, your mind becomes controlled by the presence or absence of confirmation. If someone praises you, you feel temporarily calm. If someone reassures you, anxiety softens briefly. If someone validates your feelings, you feel emotionally safe for a moment. But the moment reassurance disappears, fear returns again. This creates an exhausting cycle. The mind becomes addicted to emotional checking. Do they still care? Do they still approve? Do they still understand me? Am I still accepted? The nervous system keeps searching outward because it does not yet know how to generate emotional safety inwardly. This is why silence feels so loud to certain people. Silence removes distraction. It removes external emotional feedback. And suddenly, unresolved fears rise to the surface. Without reassurance, the mind begins creating stories. They are pulling away. They secretly dislike me. I must have ruined something. I'm being rejected. The painful part is that these stories often feel completely real emotionally, even when they are not true, because the nervous system is not responding logically, it is responding protectively. The mind believes it is trying to prevent abandonment, so it scans for danger constantly. This is why emotionally validation-dependent people often struggle deeply with unanswered messages, emotional distance, delayed responses, or unclear communication. Their nervous system interprets uncertainty as emotional instability. But Buddhist awareness invites a deeper question. What if the silence is not the true source of suffering? What if the suffering comes from the meaning your mind attaches to the silence? This changes everything, because silence itself is empty. The mind fills it. One person experiences silence and feels peace. Another experiences silence and feels panic. The silence did not create the suffering alone. The interpretation created it. And those interpretations are often shaped by old emotional wounds. A person emotionally secure within themselves may think they are probably busy. A person emotionally dependent on validation may think they no longer care about me. Same silence, different nervous system, different emotional history. This is why healing is not only about changing external relationships. It is also about understanding the emotional meanings your mind automatically creates. Many people never question these inner reactions because they happen so quickly. Silence appears, and anxiety instantly follows. They assume the anxiety proves something is wrong externally, but often the anxiety is revealing something unresolved internally. This is difficult because the human mind wants certainty. It wants reassurance that everything is okay. It wants emotional guarantees, but life rarely offers permanent reassurance. People become distracted, busy, emotionally overwhelmed, tired, quiet. Human beings naturally fluctuate emotionally. If your peace collapses every time reassurance disappears temporarily, life becomes emotionally exhausting. This is why Buddhist teachings emphasize non-attachment so strongly. Non-attachment is not emotional coldness. It is freedom from needing constant external confirmation in order to feel stable internally. That freedom is rare because many people unconsciously build their emotional worth through other people's reactions. If others praise them, they feel valuable. If others validate them, they feel seen. If others reassure them, they feel calm. But this creates emotional dependency. The nervous system stops trusting inner stability and begins relying entirely on external emotional signals. This is why silence can feel almost physically painful. It removes the emotional mirrors people use to feel secure. Without reassurance, they feel emotionally invisible again. This connects deeply to childhood emotional neglect. Many emotionally neglected children were not consistently reassured, comforted, or emotionally attuned to. So as adults, they become hypersensitive to emotional absence, not because they are weak, but because their nervous system learned that emotional distance could become painful very quickly. This creates adults who constantly seek emotional proof. Proof of love, proof of connection, proof of acceptance, proof of understanding. And silence threatens all of it because silence leaves room for uncertainty. The ego hates uncertainty. The ego wants guarantees. It wants emotional control. It wants reassurance that everything is safe and stable. But Buddhism gently teaches that certainty itself is an illusion. Human relationships change constantly. Emotions change constantly. Perceptions change constantly. Trying to secure permanent reassurance from the external world is like trying to stop the ocean from moving. Impossible and exhausting. This is why people who constantly need reassurance rarely feel fully reassured for long. The relief fades quickly because the deeper wound remains untouched. The nervous system says, "What if the reassurance disappears tomorrow?" So it keeps seeking more confirmation, more praise, more validation, more emotional proof. This is not peace, it is emotional hunger. And hunger can never fully rest while it depends entirely on others to feed it. Many people spend years believing they need more reassurance when what they actually need is deeper emotional grounding. Grounding changes the relationship with silence itself. Instead of silence automatically meaning danger, silence slowly becomes survivable. Then, eventually, silence becomes peaceful. But this transformation requires awareness. At first, silence may still trigger anxiety. The body may still tense up. Thoughts may still race. The urge to seek reassurance may still appear strongly. Healing does not erase these reactions instantly. It changes your relationship with them gradually. Instead of immediately obeying the anxiety, you begin observing it. You notice the stories forming. You notice the urge to fix, chase, explain, or seek confirmation. You notice the fear underneath the silence. And slowly, you stop treating every uncomfortable feeling as an emergency. This is one of the most important forms of emotional maturity. Learning that discomfort does not always require immediate action. Many people react impulsively to silence because they are trying to escape the anxiety it awakens. They send extra messages, seek reassurance, over-explain themselves, panic internally, create emotional pressure inside relationships. But often, they are not responding to reality itself. They are responding to old fear. This fear usually says something deeper beneath the surface. If they become emotionally distant, I may lose connection. If I lose connection, I may become emotionally abandoned. If I become emotionally abandoned, I may not survive emotionally. These fears may sound dramatic consciously, but emotionally the nervous system often reacts this way automatically. This is why silence can feel unbearable to certain people while others barely notice it. Different emotional histories create different reactions. A person securely attached internally can tolerate uncertainty more easily because their nervous system does not immediately equate silence with danger. But someone emotionally dependent on validation often feels deeply destabilized by emotional ambiguity. This ambiguity creates mental obsession. They overanalyze tiny details, the wording of messages, the timing of responses, the tone of interactions, the amount of attention received. Everything becomes emotionally significant. This creates chronic mental exhaustion because the mind never fully rests. It constantly searches for reassurance externally instead of building calm internally. Buddhist awareness interrupts this cycle by teaching presence. Presence means returning to what is actually happening now instead of drowning inside imagined fears. Right now, perhaps someone has not replied. That is reality. But the mind quickly adds layers. They hate me. They are leaving. I ruined everything. These layers create suffering. Awareness gently separates fact from story. This does not mean suppressing emotions. It means seeing them clearly without instantly believing every fear they produce. That clarity creates space inside the mind. And space changes everything. Because once space appears, the nervous system no longer controls you completely. You begin noticing something surprising. Silence itself is not destroying you. The interpretations are, the attachment is, the dependency on reassurance is. This realization can feel uncomfortable initially because many people unconsciously use validation as emotional regulation. When they feel anxious, they seek reassurance. When they feel insecure, they seek praise. When they feel uncertain, they seek confirmation. But this prevents deeper emotional stability from developing internally. It keeps the nervous system dependent outwardly. Healing begins when you slowly learn how to remain emotionally present without immediately reaching for external soothing. This is difficult because silence often forces hidden emotions upward: loneliness, fear, worthlessness, abandonment wounds, insecurity. Many people stay addicted to noise, attention, social interaction, validation, and emotional stimulation because silence confronts them with unresolved inner pain. Silence becomes a mirror, and many people fear what they will see reflected there. This is why some people cannot sit quietly without distraction. The moment external stimulation disappears, internal anxiety surfaces. Phones, messages, social media, constant communication. These often become emotional escape mechanisms from deeper, unresolved discomfort. Buddhist teachings place enormous value on silence because silence reveals the mind clearly. Without constant external reassurance, you begin seeing your attachments honestly. You begin noticing how much emotional stability depended on approval, how much self-worth depended on validation, how much peace depended on external emotional feedback. This awareness is painful at first, but also liberating, because once you see the attachment clearly, you can begin loosening it. Little by little, you stop needing constant reassurance in order to feel okay. Not because you become emotionless, but because you become more internally rooted. This is where emotional freedom begins quietly. You stop interpreting every silence personally. You stop assuming emotional absence automatically means rejection. You stop chasing reassurance compulsively, and slowly the nervous system learns something new. I can survive uncertainty. That lesson is powerful, because emotionally validation-dependent people often fear uncertainty more than reality itself. Even painful certainty can feel easier than emotional ambiguity. Why? Because ambiguity leaves room for imagination, and anxious minds often fill uncertainty with worst-case emotional stories. But awareness teaches you to remain grounded instead of immediately merging with fear. You breathe, you pause, you observe, you notice the old patterns activating, and instead of obeying them instantly, you stay present. This staying present changes the nervous system gradually. The silence no longer feels immediately catastrophic. The emotional urgency weakens, the compulsive need for reassurance softens, and something beautiful begins appearing underneath all the anxiety. Stillness, real stillness. Not silence filled with fear, silence filled with peace. Many people have never experienced peaceful silence because silence always carried emotional tension for them. But once attachment to validation weakens, silence transforms completely. It stops feeling like abandonment. It starts feeling like space. Space to breathe, space to think clearly, space to reconnect with yourself, space to exist without performing emotionally for approval. This transformation changes relationships deeply too, because when you no longer desperately need reassurance, you stop placing impossible emotional pressure on others. You stop requiring constant emotional confirmation to feel secure. You stop interpreting every moment of distance catastrophically. You stop demanding emotional certainty every second. This creates healthier connection because relationships can finally breathe. People feel safer around emotionally grounded individuals because grounded people do not force others to constantly regulate their inner world for them. This does not mean healthy reassurance disappears. Healthy relationships still include comfort, affection, validation, and emotional presence. But the difference is this: reassurance becomes supportive, not addictive. Connection becomes nourishing, not emotionally compulsory. That distinction matters deeply because addiction always creates fear. Fear of losing, fear of absence, fear of silence, fear of uncertainty. But grounded connection allows freedom. You appreciate love without clinging desperately. You appreciate understanding without depending entirely on it. You appreciate reassurance without collapsing when it temporarily disappears. This is emotional maturity, and it is deeply connected to Buddhist detachment. Detachment does not mean rejecting love. It means no longer making external validation the foundation of your emotional survival. The more this understanding grows, the more peaceful silence becomes. You begin realizing silence does not automatically mean rejection. Sometimes people are simply tired. busy, distracted, processing their own emotions, living their own lives. Not every quiet moment is secretly about you. This realization frees enormous emotional energy, because anxious attachment often creates self-centered suffering unintentionally. The mind assumes every silence reflects personal rejection, but life is far bigger than the fearful stories anxiety creates. Once you stop personalizing every silence, your nervous system begins relaxing naturally. You stop monitoring people constantly. You stop searching for hidden emotional threats everywhere. You stop exhausting yourself emotionally, trying to secure endless reassurance. And for the first time, you begin discovering what internal peace actually feels like. A quieter mind, a calmer body, a heart no longer addicted to constant emotional confirmation. This peace does not appear overnight. The old patterns may still arise sometimes. Silence may still trigger anxiety occasionally. The urge to seek reassurance may still appear. But awareness changes how deeply those reactions control you. Instead of drowning inside fear, you notice it gently. You remind yourself, this silence is awakening old fear. You do not need to panic. You do not need to chase. You do not need to abandon yourself right now. That self-awareness becomes healing, because emotionally neglected parts of you finally receive something they rarely received before. Presence without panic, compassion without shame, stillness without abandonment. This is why Buddhist teachings place such importance on sitting quietly with yourself, not to punish yourself, but to discover that your worth still exists even when nobody is actively validating it. That realization changes everything internally, because eventually you stop asking, who is reassuring me right now, and begin asking, can I remain connected to myself even in silence? That question leads toward freedom, real freedom, the freedom to exist peacefully without constant external emotional confirmation, the freedom to rest without endlessly checking for reassurance, the freedom to experience silence without immediately translating it into fear, and perhaps most importantly, the freedom to finally stop abandoning yourself every time validation temporarily disappears, because silence was never truly the enemy. The real suffering came from believing your emotional safety could only exist when someone else continuously confirmed your worth. Once that attachment softens, silence stops feeling threatening. And slowly, quietly, it begins feeling like home. And slowly, this is where the deeper danger finally becomes visible. The problem was never only the fear of silence. The real danger begins when a person builds their entire identity around other people's reactions, because the moment your sense of self depends on external approval, your inner world becomes fragile. Every opinion becomes powerful. Every criticism becomes personal. Every misunderstanding becomes destabilizing, and your peace begins rising and falling according to emotions you cannot control. There is a painful emptiness that appears when a person no longer knows who they are without validation. Beneath the smiles, the achievements, the explanations, and the constant emotional effort, there is often a quiet fear whispering, if people stop approving of me, who am I without their confirmation? Many people never ask themselves this question directly because they spend most of their lives chasing the next form of external reassurance. Praise, attention, approval, recognition, understanding, acceptance. They become emotionally dependent on being reflected positively by the world around them. And at first, this dependency feels normal because society rewards it constantly. From childhood, many people are taught to measure their worth through external reactions. Good grades bring praise. Obedience brings approval. Success brings admiration. Being useful brings love. Being emotionally convenient brings acceptance. Slowly, identity becomes attached to performance. A child learns, When others approve of me, I am valuable. And over time, this unconscious belief becomes dangerous because the person stops developing stable inner grounding. Their identity becomes entirely dependent on emotional mirrors outside themselves. This creates a restless life because people's opinions constantly change. One moment someone praises you, the next moment they criticize you, one moment they understand you, the next moment they misunderstand you completely. If your identity is built on external perception, your inner world will constantly shake with every emotional shift around you. This is exactly what Buddhist teachings warn about so deeply. Buddhism teaches that attachment to unstable things creates suffering, and few things are more unstable than human approval. Human beings are inconsistent, emotional, reactive, projective, distracted, fearful. People may love you one day and judge you the next without you changing at all. If your sense of self depends entirely on those shifting reactions, peace becomes impossible. This is why many people secretly feel emotionally exhausted even when life appears successful externally. They are constantly maintaining an identity rather than simply living authentically. They monitor reactions, adjust behavior, manage perception, protect image, seek emotional confirmation. Everything becomes tied to how others respond. This creates chronic anxiety because the nervous system never fully rests. It remains emotionally dependent on outside validation for stability. The mind becomes fragile because it has no center within itself. This fragility often hides behind high achievement. Many people who seem confident externally are secretly terrified internally because their identity is built entirely on approval. As long as others admire them, they feel secure. As long as they are praised, they feel worthy. As long as people validate them, they feel emotionally safe. But the moment criticism appears, their entire inner world begins collapsing. Why? Because criticism does not simply challenge behavior, it threatens identity itself. This is why some people cannot tolerate disapproval calmly. Even small criticism feels emotionally devastating because the nervous system interprets it as danger, not danger to the body, danger to the self-image they built for survival. This is where Buddhism introduces one of its most radical teachings. The self most people spend their lives protecting is often built from attachment, fear, memory, conditioning, and external reflection. Many people do not actually know themselves deeply. They know the version of themselves that receives approval. They know the version that avoids rejection. They know the version that keeps connections stable. But underneath all of that adaptation, there is often confusion about who they truly are. This creates a painful inner emptiness because external validation can temporarily strengthen identity, but it cannot permanently stabilize it. The ego constantly needs more recognition, more praise, more reassurance, more understanding, more proof of worth. This endless hunger creates suffering because no amount of external approval can permanently quiet a mind disconnected from inner grounding. At first, approval feels soothing. Someone compliments you, validates you, admires you, understands you, and for a brief moment the nervous system relaxes. But then fear quietly returns. What if they stop approving of me? What if they change their mind? What if I disappoint them? What if they see the real me and reject me? This fear exists because externally built identity is inherently unstable. It depends entirely on conditions outside your control. Buddhist wisdom warns against building inner stability on unstable foundations. If your peace depends on praise, criticism will destroy you. If your worth depends on approval, rejection will terrify you. If your identity depends on being understood, misunderstanding will consume you emotionally. This is why attachment to external validation creates such deep restlessness. The mind becomes trapped in constant emotional maintenance. You stop asking, what feels true, and begin asking, how will this be perceived? That question slowly disconnects people from authenticity. Instead of living naturally, they begin performing emotionally for acceptance. Some become perfectionists, some become chronic people-pleasers, some become emotionally agreeable even when suffering internally. Some become obsessed with achievement, some become addicted to praise. But underneath all these patterns is usually the same fear. If I stop receiving approval, I may stop feeling valuable. This fear creates fragile identity. Fragile identity constantly needs reinforcement, and reinforcement requires external emotional supply. This is why certain people cannot tolerate being misunderstood quietly. Their identity feels threatened by negative perception. They feel emotionally compelled to defend themselves because internally they do not yet feel stable enough to let misunderstanding exist without panic. The ego says, correct them immediately. Protect your image. Control the narrative. Make them see you properly. But this creates endless mental exhaustion because controlling perception is impossible long-term. No human being can fully control how others interpret them. People will always project their own fears, wounds, insecurities, and emotional limitations onto you. Someone insecure may see arrogance where there is confidence. Someone emotionally wounded may see rejection where there are healthy boundaries. Someone fearful may see selfishness where there is self-respect. Trying to emotionally manage all these perceptions will eventually destroy inner peace completely. This is why Buddhist teachings encourage detachment from praise and blame alike. Not because praise is evil, not because criticism should be ignored entirely, but because emotional dependence on either creates instability. A grounded mind appreciates praise without becoming addicted to it, and listens to criticism without becoming shattered by it. This balance creates emotional freedom, but many people never develop this balance because childhood conditioning taught them that approval equals survival. Children naturally depend on caregivers emotionally. When love becomes heavily tied to performance, obedience, success, or emotional convenience, the child unconsciously learns that acceptance must be earned. This creates adults who constantly seek emotional confirmation from the world. They become shapeshifters emotionally. Different versions of themselves appear depending on who they are around. Not because they are fake intentionally, but because identity became adaptive instead of rooted. This adaptation can become so automatic that people lose connection with their authentic feelings completely. They know how to please others better than they know themselves. They know how to gain approval better than they know what truly brings them peace. And this creates profound inner confusion, because external validation may bring temporary comfort, but it cannot create true self-understanding. Only awareness can do that. Buddhist practice repeatedly points inward because truth cannot be fully discovered through external reflection alone. Silence becomes important because silence reveals what remains when approval disappears. Who are you when nobody is praising you? Who are you when nobody validates your feelings? Who are you when nobody confirms your worth? These questions can feel terrifying initially because many people have spent their entire lives constructing identity through external mirrors. Without those mirrors, emptiness appears, but that emptiness is not punishment. It is invitation. Invitation to discover yourself beyond performance, beyond approval, beyond image management, beyond emotional dependency. This process feels uncomfortable because externally built identity constantly seeks reassurance. The mind says, "Tell me I matter, tell me I am good enough, tell me I am worthy, tell me I am understood." But Buddhist wisdom gently asks something deeper. Can you remain connected to your worth even when reassurance disappears temporarily? That question changes everything internally, because true peace begins when identity stops depending entirely on external reflection. This does not mean becoming emotionally isolated or refusing healthy connection. Humans naturally need love, support, and understanding. Buddhism does not reject human connection. It warns against attachment to connection as the sole source of identity. There is a difference. Healthy connection nourishes. Attachment controls. When attachment controls identity, fear enters every relationship. Fear of losing approval, fear of disappointing others, fear of criticism, fear of misunderstanding, fear of rejection. This fear creates constant self-monitoring. People begin editing themselves emotionally to maintain acceptance. They suppress authentic emotions, avoid conflict, hide parts of themselves, perform kindness while feeling resentment internally, pretend agreement while feeling disconnected inwardly. This performance slowly creates inner fragmentation. The outer self becomes disconnected from the inner self. And this disconnect creates suffering because human beings cannot feel peaceful while constantly abandoning themselves for approval. Many people do not realize how much of their personality is built around avoiding disapproval. Their opinions, behaviors, emotional reactions, even life decisions become shaped by external acceptance rather than inner truth. This is why some people feel deeply lost when relationships end or approval disappears. Without the external reflection they relied on, identity itself feels unstable. They ask painful questions. Who am I without this person's validation? Who am I if people stop admiring me? Who am I if I disappoint others? These questions reveal how deeply identity became attached to external perception. Buddhist teachings invite people into a different kind of stability. Not stability built on praise, not stability built on image, but stability built on awareness itself. Awareness observes praise without becoming addicted. Awareness observes criticism without becoming destroyed. Awareness remains present beneath emotional fluctuation. This creates a mind that becomes less fragile over time. Fragility comes from dependence. Strength comes from grounded awareness. A fragile mind constantly seeks confirmation because it does not trust itself internally. A grounded mind still appreciates understanding and connection, but no longer collapses without them. This changes every area of life. Relationships become healthier because you stop forcing others to constantly maintain your self-worth emotionally. Work becomes healthier because achievement no longer determines your value completely. Social interaction becomes healthier because you stop performing for acceptance constantly. Even silence becomes healthier because your identity no longer disappears when external attention fades. This transformation is gradual. The ego resists it strongly, because the ego feels safest when externally reinforced. The ego wants emotional guarantees. It wants admiration. It wants recognition. It wants certainty about worth. But certainty built externally will always remain unstable. Why? Because human perception constantly changes. Today someone admires you. Tomorrow they misunderstand you. Today they praise you. Tomorrow they criticize you. If your identity rises and falls with every opinion, your emotional life becomes chaotic. This is why many highly praised people remain deeply insecure internally. External validation cannot fully heal internal disconnection. No amount of praise can permanently stabilize an identity built entirely through approval. The hunger always returns. This is why Buddhist teachings often describe attachment as endless thirst. The mind says, just one more compliment, just one more reassurance, just one more confirmation. But satisfaction fades quickly because external approval was never designed to become the foundation of identity. True identity grows differently. It grows through awareness, through honesty, through self-observation, through emotional presence, through learning how to remain connected to yourself, even during criticism, misunderstanding, or emotional uncertainty. This creates inner stability, and inner stability changes the relationship with the world completely. You stop needing everyone to agree with you. You stop panicking over every misunderstanding. You stop emotionally collapsing every time approval shifts, because your identity is no longer built entirely on external emotional weather. This does not mean criticism stops hurting completely. Human beings naturally feel pain sometimes when judged unfairly. But the difference is that the pain no longer destroys your sense of self entirely. A grounded person can hear criticism and reflect without losing identity. A fragile person hears criticism and feels existentially threatened. This distinction matters deeply, because many people spend their lives trying to protect fragile identities instead of building grounded awareness. Protection creates exhaustion. Awareness creates peace. Protection constantly asks, how do I stop people from judging me? Awareness asks, why does judgment control my inner world so deeply? That second question leads toward freedom, because eventually you realize something profound. People's opinions cannot define your essence unless you emotionally surrender that power to them. This realization slowly restores inner authority. You begin speaking more honestly because approval matters less. You begin setting boundaries more clearly because fear of rejection weakens. You begin living more authentically because identity becomes internally rooted instead of externally performed. This authenticity feels peaceful because the nervous system stops carrying the exhausting burden of constant image management. Many people do not realize how tiring performance truly is until they stop performing. For years, they may shape themselves around expectations, trying to be good enough, pleasant enough, impressive enough, understandable enough, acceptable enough. But eventually the soul becomes exhausted from constantly earning worth. Buddhist wisdom interrupts this cycle gently. It says, your worth was never created by praise to begin with, and if praise did not create your worth, criticism cannot destroy it either. This understanding changes how you move through life. You still care about treating others well. You still value connection. You still appreciate understanding, but your identity no longer depends entirely on emotional approval. That dependence softens, and as it softens, the mind becomes quieter, more stable, less reactive, less fearful, less desperate for constant confirmation. This is the beginning of real peace, not because the world suddenly stops judging, but because you stop making judgment the center of your identity. The world may still misunderstand you sometimes, criticize you sometimes, reject you sometimes, but your inner world no longer collapses completely every time perception shifts externally. You remain connected to yourself, calmly, honestly, steadily, and perhaps this is one of the deepest forms of Buddhist freedom, not escaping human emotion entirely, but no longer allowing temporary opinions to control the foundation of your being. Because the moment identity stops depending entirely on approval, something extraordinary happens internally. The mind finally begins to rest. Not perfectly, not instantly, but genuinely. The endless performance weakens. The desperate need for validation softens. The fear of misunderstanding loses intensity, and slowly, quietly, you begin discovering who you are beneath all the emotional adaptation. Not the version built for approval, not the version shaped for acceptance, but the deeper self that existed before the world taught you to measure your worth through other people's reactions. That self is calmer, quieter, less afraid, less fragile, and far more peaceful than the identity built entirely through praise could ever be. And once you begin to see how fragile the mind becomes when identity depends on approval, another truth begins to rise quietly from underneath. Many people are not really explaining themselves because communication is needed. They are explaining because fear has taken control of their voice. They believe they are being clear. They believe they are being honest. They believe they are simply trying to avoid confusion. But beneath the long messages, the repeated details, the emotional defense and the desperate need to be understood, there is often a hidden fear whispering, "If they misunderstand me, they may leave. If they judge me, I may lose connection. If I do not explain enough, I may not be safe." That is why over-explaining feels so exhausting. It is not only speech, it is fear trying to survive through words. There is a moment many people know too well. You say something simple, but then anxiety enters. Suddenly, one sentence becomes five. 5 sentences become a full explanation. A small clarification turns into a long, emotional defense. You start adding details nobody asked for. You soften your words. You justify your intention. You explain your tone. You explain your past. You explain why you explained. And by the end, you are not even sure if you communicated clearly or simply begged to be seen without judgment. This is the hidden pain of over-explaining. It often begins as communication, but slowly becomes self-protection. The words are no longer only meant to share truth. They are meant to prevent rejection, stop abandonment, avoid criticism, and control how someone receives you. The mind says, "Let me explain better," but the body is saying, "Please do not leave me." This is why over-explaining is not always a language problem. It is often a nervous system problem. A calm nervous system can speak clearly and stop. An anxious nervous system keeps adding more because silence feels unsafe. It does not trust that the truth can stand on its own. It does not trust that the other person will understand without being guided carefully through every emotional detail. It does not trust that connection can survive misunderstanding. So it keeps talking, not from peace, from fear. Buddhist teachings remind us that fear often disguises itself as wisdom. The mind can make anxiety sound reasonable. It says, "I just want to be clear. I just do not want them to think badly of me. I just need them to know my heart. I just want to avoid conflict." But if you look closely, you may notice that the explanation is not coming from stillness. It is coming from urgency. And urgency is often the signature of fear. True communication does not feel desperate. It may feel serious. It may feel vulnerable. It may feel important. But it does not feel like your entire worth depends on the other person's response. Over-explaining feels different. It feels tight, pressured, restless. It feels like you cannot stop until the other person reacts in a way that calms you down. That is the difference. Communication shares. Fear tries to control. Communication offers understanding. Fear demands reassurance. Communication respects the other person's mind. Fear tries to manage it. This does not mean everyone who over-explains is manipulative. Most are not. Many are deeply sensitive people who learned that being misunderstood once caused pain, punishment, rejection, or emotional distance. Their explaining is not cruelty. It is a survival pattern, but survival patterns can still become prisons. The person who over-explains often believes they are protecting the relationship, but slowly they may begin losing themselves inside the effort to prevent every possible misunderstanding. They begin speaking before they know what they truly feel. They apologize before anyone accuses them. They defend before anyone attacks. They justify before anyone questions. They carry the burden of making sure nobody ever interprets them incorrectly. That burden is impossible. And because it is impossible, it creates endless exhaustion. The fear beneath over-explaining usually has roots deeper than the present situation. Many people who constantly explain themselves grew up in spaces where their words were twisted, dismissed, ignored, or punished. They learned that simple truth was not enough. They had to prove their innocence, prove their pain, prove their intentions, prove they were not being difficult, selfish, dramatic, rude, or wrong. So as adults, they do not simply speak. They present evidence. Every conversation becomes a quiet courtroom. They are the witness, the accused, the lawyer, and sometimes even the judge. This is why over-explaining can feel so draining. You are not simply talking to another person. You are internally defending yourself against old accusations that may not even belong to the moment. Someone asks, "Why did you do that?" And the nervous system hears, "You are in trouble." Someone says, "I did not understand what you meant." And the nervous system hears, "You are being judged." Someone becomes quiet, and the nervous system hears, "You are about to be abandoned." So the words rush out, fast, heavy, overloaded, not because the present moment truly requires all those words, but because the past is speaking through the body. This is why Buddhist awareness is so important. It teaches you to notice not only what you are saying, but where the words are coming from. Are they coming from clarity or fear? Are they coming from truth or panic? Are they coming from love or the desperate need to be approved? The same sentence can carry a completely different energy depending on its source. You can say, "Let me explain," from calmness, and it becomes healthy communication. You can say, "Let me explain," from fear, and it becomes emotional self-defense. The words may sound similar, but the inner state is different. And the inner state matters, because when fear drives communication, the conversation often becomes heavier than it needs to be. The other person may feel overwhelmed, pressured, or emotionally responsible for calming you. They may begin pulling away, not because your feelings are invalid, but because the energy of desperation becomes difficult to hold. Then the over-explainer feels even more afraid. They think, "They are pulling away because I did not explain enough." So they explain more. But the more they explain from panic, the more tension grows. This becomes a painful cycle. Fear creates over-explaining. Over-explaining creates pressure. Pressure creates distance. Distance creates more fear. And the person trapped in the cycle cannot understand why their efforts to create closeness often create exhaustion instead. This is why wisdom asks us to pause before explaining more. A pause can reveal what a flood of words hides. Sometimes before speaking, the most important question is not, "How do I make them understand?" The deeper question is, "What am I afraid will happen if they do not?" That question opens the hidden door, because behind over-explaining, there is often fear of rejection. Fear that if someone misunderstands you, they will dislike you. Fear that if they dislike you, they will leave. Fear that if they leave, it confirms you were never enough. That is a heavy fear to carry inside ordinary conversations. No wonder the mind becomes exhausted. Every misunderstanding begins to feel like a threat to belonging. Every disagreement begins to feel like possible abandonment. Every criticism begins to feel like proof of unworthiness. So the person over-explains not only to clarify, but to preserve connection. This is why telling someone, "Just stop caring what people think," rarely helps. The pattern is not only intellectual, it is emotional. It lives in the body. It is tied to old experiences of rejection, shame, punishment, or emotional distance. A person does not stop over-explaining by shaming themselves into silence. They stop by building enough inner safety to no longer need words as armor. That is the key. Words become armor when silence feels dangerous. Words become armor when misunderstanding feels like rejection. Words become armor when your identity depends on being seen correctly. But armor is heavy. Even when it protects you, it exhausts you. Over time, Over-explaining makes the mind restless because it trains you to believe peace depends on total control of perception. You begin trying to remove every possible wrong interpretation before it appears. You speak not only to the person in front of you, but to every fear inside you. You answer questions nobody asked. You apologize for emotions nobody condemned. You clarify intentions nobody doubted. You defend yourself against imaginary judgment. This is how fear turns communication into self-erasure, because eventually your words are no longer guided by truth alone. They are guided by what you hope will keep you safe. This can make you lose contact with your natural voice. You may begin speaking carefully all the time, editing yourself, softening yourself, making your truth more acceptable, explaining your boundaries as if they are crimes, explaining your needs as if they are burdens, explaining your pain as if it needs permission to exist. But a soul cannot feel peaceful while constantly defending its right to be human. Buddhism teaches that suffering deepens when we cling to an image of ourselves that must be protected at all costs. Over-explaining often comes from clinging to the image of being good, kind, reasonable, harmless, loyal, or misunderstood. You do not only want to be good, you want to be seen as good. You do not only want to be honest, you want everyone to recognize your honesty. You do not only want to be fair, you want nobody to accuse you of being unfair. And this attachment creates fear, because the world will not always confirm your preferred image. Someone may still call you selfish when you set a healthy boundary. Someone may still call you cold when you choose silence. Someone may still call you dramatic when you express pain. Someone may still call you wrong when you know your heart was sincere. If you spend your life trying to prevent every false label, you will live in constant emotional defense. The Buddhist path invites a different strength, the strength to act with integrity, speak with clarity, and release the outcome. This does not mean you never explain. Explanation has its place. Healthy communication matters. Misunderstandings sometimes need correction. Relationships need honesty. But there is a difference between explaining from grounded clarity and explaining from fear of emotional punishment. Grounded explanation is simple. It respects your truth. It respects the other person's freedom. It does not beg. It does not chase. It does not collapse if the other person still does not agree. Fear-based explanation cannot stop because it is not satisfied with expression. It needs control. It needs the other person to respond correctly. It needs reassurance. It needs emotional rescue. And when that reassurance does not come, the mind feels exposed. This is where healing becomes necessary. You begin practicing the courage to say what is true without decorating it with endless defense. You begin learning to let a simple sentence be enough. You begin allowing some pauses to remain unfilled. You begin noticing the urge to add more and gently asking, is this needed or am I afraid? That question can change your life, because over-explaining often happens in the tiny space between discomfort and reaction. You feel a shift in someone's tone. Discomfort rises. Before you even understand it, words begin rushing out. But if awareness enters that tiny space, the pattern weakens. You feel the urge. You pause. You breathe. You notice fear. You do not attack the fear. You simply do not let it drive the entire conversation. This is Buddhist mindfulness in real life. Not only sitting quietly with closed eyes, but catching the mind before it turns fear into speech. When you do this repeatedly, something inside begins to trust silence again. You realize you can say less and still survive. You can be misunderstood and still remain whole. You can disappoint someone and still be worthy. You can allow a pause without rushing to fill it with self-defense. This is not easy for people who have spent years using words to prevent abandonment. At first, saying less may feel terrifying. You may feel exposed. You may feel guilty. You may feel like you are being rude, cold, or careless. But often, that discomfort is not proof that silence is wrong. It is proof that you are practicing a new kind of safety. The old pattern says, explain until the fear goes away. The new awareness says, feel the fear without becoming its servant. That is freedom, because if you only feel safe after someone understands you perfectly, your peace will always depend on conditions you cannot control. But if you can feel fear and still remain grounded, you begin reclaiming your life from external perception. This reclamation changes the body too. The nervous system slowly learns that not every misunderstanding is danger. Not every criticism is abandonment. Not every silence is rejection. Not every question is accusation. As this lesson deepens, communication becomes cleaner. You stop adding emotional clutter. You stop defending every detail. You stop using long explanations to prove innocence. You begin speaking from the center instead of from panic. This makes your words more powerful, not weaker, because fear often makes speech scattered. Clarity makes speech simple. A person who speaks from fear may use many words and still not feel understood. A person who speaks from calm may use fewer words and feel complete, even if the other person disagrees. That is true inner strength. Not controlling the listener, being anchored in the speaker. Many over-explainers secretly believe that if they do not make the other person understand, the conversation is incomplete. But sometimes completion is not agreement. Sometimes completion is simply knowing you spoke truthfully. The other person's response is not always the measure of your clarity. Some people will misunderstand because they are unable to hear beyond their own emotional filters. Some will misunderstand because accepting your truth would require them to face themselves. Some will misunderstand because they benefit from your confusion. Some will misunderstand because they are not listening to understand, but to defend their own position. If you keep explaining to someone who is committed to not understanding, you are not communicating anymore. You are sacrificing your peace at the altar of their resistance. Wisdom learns when to stop. Stopping does not mean you lost. It means you recognize that your energy is sacred. This is another Buddhist lesson many people overlook. Attention is life energy. Wherever your attention goes, your life goes. If your attention is constantly trapped in defending yourself, your life becomes smaller. You have less energy for joy, less energy for creativity, less energy for rest, less energy for love, less energy for spiritual growth. Because so much of your life force is spent trying to be understood by people who may not even be willing to understand. At some point, a person must ask, is this explanation creating peace, or is it feeding fear? That question is powerful because not all explanations are healing. Some explanations are just another way of reopening the wound. You explain, hoping to feel safe. They respond poorly. You explain again. They misunderstand again. You feel smaller. Then you tell yourself you need to explain better. But perhaps the lesson is not to explain better. Perhaps the lesson is to stop offering your peace to people who cannot hold it with care. This does not mean becoming harsh. It means becoming discerning. There are people who deserve your explanations because they listen with humility. There are people who deserve your vulnerability because they honor it. There are people who deserve deeper conversation because they meet you with sincerity. But not everyone deserves endless access to your emotional world. Over-explaining often ignores this truth. It gives sacred emotional energy to people who have not shown emotional responsibility. And when your deepest truth is repeatedly mishandled, the wound grows. Buddhist wisdom teaches compassion, but compassion does not mean unlimited exposure to harm. You can be compassionate and still have boundaries. You can forgive and still stop explaining. You can love someone and still refuse to keep handing them weapons against your peace. This is maturity, the ability to recognize when explanation is useful and when it is self-abandonment. Many people over-explain because they hope to prevent judgment, but judgment cannot always be prevented. Some people judge quickly, some judge from insecurity, some judge because it makes them feel superior, some judge because they do not want to understand complexity. Trying to prevent all judgment is like trying to prevent rain from touching the ground. Impossible. But you can learn not to build your home in the storm. You can let judgment pass without chasing it. You can let misunderstanding exist without becoming its prisoner. You can let people think what they think without turning their opinion into your identity. That is the rare peace this path points toward. The mind that no longer needs to explain everything is not careless. It is free. Free from the constant pressure to be perfectly interpreted. Free from the fear that one wrong opinion can destroy your worth. Free from the emotional labor of controlling every narrative. Free from the exhausting belief that connection must be maintained through endless self-defense. And as this freedom grows, you begin to notice something beautiful. You speak less, but your words carry more truth. You explain less, but your presence becomes more peaceful. You defend less, but your boundaries become stronger. You chase less, but your dignity returns. This is what happens when fear stops controlling communication. Your voice becomes cleaner, your silence becomes safer, your relationships become more honest, and your mind becomes less crowded with the need to manage everyone's perception. Over-explaining may have once protected you. It may have helped you survive difficult homes, unpredictable relationships, or painful misunderstandings. It may have been the only way you knew how to seek safety, so do not hate that part of yourself. Thank it gently, then teach it a new way. Tell it, we do not have to earn safety through endless words anymore. We do not have to explain our humanity to everyone. We do not have to convince people who are committed to misunderstanding. We can speak clearly, then return to peace. This is how the pattern begins to soften, not by forcing silence, but by building safety beneath speech. And as safety grows, the need to over-explain naturally weakens. You begin trusting that your worth can survive being questioned. Your peace can survive being misunderstood. Your identity can survive disapproval. Your heart can survive not being fully seen by everyone. That is emotional freedom. Because the true goal is not to become someone who never explains. The goal is to become someone whose explanations no longer come from fear. Someone who can communicate with honesty, stop with dignity, and rest without needing perfect approval. Someone who understands that real connection does not require emotional begging. Someone who knows that love built on constant self-defense is not safety. Someone who no longer uses words as a shield against abandonment. And when that shift happens, the mind finally begins to quiet. Not because everyone understands you, but because you no longer abandon yourself trying to make them. And slowly, this is where a person begins to discover one of the rarest forms of emotional strength. Not the strength of winning every argument, not the strength of proving everyone wrong, but the strength of remaining calm even when someone sees you incorrectly. Because true maturity begins the moment misunderstanding stops feeling like danger. There is a quiet pain that appears when someone misjudges your heart, especially when your intentions were sincere, especially when you tried to be kind, especially when you gave your effort, your honesty, your patience, and still walked away carrying a false image inside someone else's mind. For many people, this feels unbearable, not because the misunderstanding itself is always severe, but because the nervous system reacts as if something deeply threatening is happening. The body tightens. Thoughts race. The mind begins preparing explanations immediately. You replay the conversation. You imagine correcting them. You mentally defend yourself again and again. Why? Because somewhere inside, misunderstanding became connected to emotional danger. The mind says, If they misjudge me, I may lose connection. If I lose connection, I may become rejected. If I become rejected, I may no longer feel safe emotionally. This is why many people cannot remain calm when misunderstood. Their reaction is not only intellectual, it is survival-based. And yet Buddhism teaches something radically freeing. A misunderstanding is painful, but suffering multiplies when the mind treats misunderstanding as a threat to identity itself. This is where emotional maturity begins separating itself from emotional reactivity. An emotionally reactive mind says, "Correct this immediately." An emotionally mature mind pauses first, not because it enjoys being misunderstood, not because it lacks feelings, but because it no longer believes every false perception must be emotionally fought in order to preserve inner peace. That discipline is rare. Most people panic internally when judged unfairly. Even if they remain outwardly calm, their mind becomes chaotic. They obsess over what was said. They imagine future conversations. They mentally defend themselves for hours or days. The body may leave the situation, but internally they are still trapped inside it. This happens because the ego is deeply attached to image. The ego wants to be seen correctly, respected correctly, understood correctly, validated correctly. And when reality does not cooperate, the ego reacts like it is under attack. But Buddhism teaches that attachment to image creates suffering because image itself is unstable. Human perception constantly shifts. People see through their own fears, wounds, insecurities, expectations, and emotional limitations. Someone may see selfishness where there was self-respect. Someone may see weakness where there was vulnerability. Someone may see coldness where there was exhaustion. Someone may see arrogance where there was confidence. You cannot fully control how human beings interpret your existence. This is why trying to control every perception creates endless inner tension. The mind becomes hypervigilant, emotionally defensive, constantly preparing for misunderstanding, constantly trying to manage impressions, and eventually life begins feeling like performance instead of presence. This is why remaining calm when misjudged is such deep spiritual discipline. It requires the nervous system to stop treating perception like survival. That does not happen automatically. Most people are conditioned from childhood to seek approval and avoid rejection. Many learned very early that being misunderstood carried emotional consequences. Maybe misunderstanding led to punishment. Maybe it led to shame. Maybe it led to emotional withdrawal. Maybe it led to ridicule. Maybe nobody listened long enough to understand properly. So the child learned, I must prevent misunderstanding at all costs. That child grows into an adult who becomes emotionally destabilized whenever someone interprets them negatively. The adult may appear functional externally, but internally they are still trying to avoid the old pain of emotional rejection. This is why emotional maturity is not simply about controlling behavior, it is about retraining the nervous system itself. The mature mind begins realizing something important. Misunderstanding is uncomfortable, but not deadly. Criticism is painful but survivable. False assumptions are frustrating, but they do not erase your truth internally. This realization changes the body slowly. Instead of reacting immediately, awareness begins entering the space between stimulus and reaction. Someone misjudges you. The old nervous system panics instantly. The new awareness pauses. That pause changes everything. Because inside that pause, you begin seeing your reaction clearly instead of automatically becoming it. You notice the urge to defend yourself, the urge to explain, the urge to control perception, the urge to restore emotional safety quickly. And instead of immediately obeying the urge, you breathe. That breathing is not weakness, it is mastery. Because real mastery is not controlling other people's opinions, it is controlling your relationship to them. Many people believe emotional strength means never caring what anyone thinks, but that is not realistic. Human beings naturally care about connection and perception to some degree. True maturity is not emotional numbness. It is emotional stability. It is being able to feel pain without becoming consumed by it. It is being able to hear misunderstanding without abandoning your center. It is being able to remain grounded while another person projects their confusion onto you. That grounding becomes powerful because most suffering after conflict comes not from the event itself, but from resistance. The mind keeps saying, "They should not see me this way. They should know my intentions. They should understand my heart." And maybe they should. But reality does not always obey fairness. People misunderstand each other constantly. Some misunderstand accidentally, some misunderstand carelessly, some misunderstand intentionally because it protects their ego. Some misunderstand because they only see through their own wounds. And if your peace depends on preventing all misunderstanding, peace will remain impossible. This is why Buddhist detachment becomes essential. Detachment is not indifference, it is the ability to remain internally steady even when external perception becomes unstable. That steadiness creates freedom. Without steadiness, every opinion becomes emotionally dangerous. A single criticism ruins your day. A single misunderstanding consumes your thoughts. A single judgment pulls you into emotional chaos. But with awareness, you begin seeing opinions differently. You stop treating them as absolute truth. You begin understanding that human perception is deeply subjective. People interpret reality through memory, trauma, insecurity, expectation, culture, and emotional state. Two people can witness the same event and create completely different stories about it. Once you understand this deeply, the nervous system slowly stops panicking over every interpretation. Not because misunderstanding suddenly feels pleasant, but because you no longer treat every misunderstanding like proof of personal failure. This matters because many people secretly build identity around being good in the eyes of others. So when someone misjudges them, it feels like identity itself is collapsing. The mind says, "If they think badly of me, maybe I really am bad." This creates emotional fragility because your worth becomes dependent on external interpretation. Buddhist wisdom warns against this deeply. It teaches that identity built through external reflection is unstable by nature. One moment people praise you. The next moment they criticize you. One moment they understand you. The next moment they project onto you completely. If your self-worth rises and falls with these fluctuations, your mind will never rest. That is why calmness during misunderstanding is such profound emotional maturity. It means your identity no longer collapses every time perception changes externally. You remain rooted inwardly, not arrogantly, not defensively, but quietly, steadily. This steadiness takes practice because the ego constantly wants to react. The ego wants immediate correction, immediate justice, immediate validation. But emotional maturity understands something deeper. Not every misunderstanding requires a battle. Not every false assumption deserves your energy. Not every opinion deserves access to your peace. This realization changes communication completely. You stop explaining compulsively. You stop defending every detail. You stop emotionally chasing people to force understanding. Instead, you become more discerning. Sometimes you clarify calmly. Sometimes you stay silent peacefully. Sometimes you walk away entirely, not from weakness, from wisdom. Because wisdom understands that exhausting yourself emotionally trying to control every perception is not peace, it is bondage. Many people secretly believe calmness means suppressing emotions, but true calmness is not suppression. Suppression hides emotional reaction beneath tension. Real calmness comes from reduced attachment. You still feel pain, you still notice misunderstanding, but you no longer become emotionally possessed by it. That difference is enormous. A possessed mind obsesses, replays, defends, chases. A grounded mind notices pain without becoming imprisoned by it. This grounding often feels strange initially because reactive behavior became familiar for many people. Emotional urgency felt normal. Defending yourself immediately felt necessary, but over time, awareness creates new internal space. Someone judges you unfairly. Instead of spiraling instantly, you observe your reaction. You notice the tightness, the anger, the fear, the urge to correct. And slowly you realize something surprising. You do not have to obey every emotional impulse. That realization changes relationships completely. Because emotionally reactive people often escalate conflict unconsciously. Their fear of being misunderstood becomes so intense that they push harder and harder trying to force clarity. But force rarely creates understanding. Often it creates more resistance, more defensiveness, more emotional distance. The calmer mind understands this. It knows that not every misunderstanding can be solved through more explanation. Some people are simply unwilling to see clearly. Some are emotionally immature. Some are committed to their own narrative. Some need you to remain the villain because it protects their identity. No amount of emotional effort can force awareness into someone who refuses it. This is painful to accept, but deeply freeing, because once you accept this truth, you stop exhausting yourself trying to open closed minds. You stop sacrificing your nervous system trying to achieve impossible emotional outcomes. You begin protecting your peace instead. This protection is not selfish, it is necessary. A constantly reactive mind cannot experience stillness deeply. It lives in permanent emotional defense, always preparing, always correcting, always monitoring perception, always trying to prevent judgment. That state destroys inner calm slowly. Buddhist practice interrupts this by teaching observation before reaction. You begin watching your emotional storms instead of instantly becoming them. You notice how quickly the ego wants to restore image. You notice how intensely the nervous system fears rejection. You notice how strongly the mind wants external validation. And through awareness, those reactions slowly lose some of their power. This is why mindfulness is not passive. It is active emotional discipline. A reactive mind believes every thought immediately. They misunderstood me. This is terrible. A mindful mind pauses. Yes, this hurts. But do I need to abandon my peace over it? That question creates inner freedom, because the answer slowly becomes no. You do not need to destroy your nervous system every time someone sees you incorrectly. You do not need to explain yourself endlessly to feel worthy. You do not need universal understanding in order to remain whole. This realization softens emotional panic gradually, and something beautiful begins happening internally. You stop seeing misunderstanding as catastrophe. You begin seeing it as part of human limitation. Human beings misunderstand constantly because human beings are imperfect observers. Even you misunderstand others sometimes, not intentionally, but because perception is filtered through personal experience. Once you understand this universally, you stop taking every misunderstanding as personal attack. Sometimes it simply reflects human limitation. This perspective creates compassion too. Instead of instantly demonizing people who misjudge you, you begin recognizing that many are trapped inside their own fears and projections. This does not mean tolerating abuse. Boundaries still matter deeply, but boundaries can exist without emotional chaos. You can protect yourself calmly, you can walk away peacefully, you can disagree without internal collapse. That is maturity. Immature emotional patterns react impulsively because identity feels threatened constantly. Mature emotional awareness responds intentionally because identity is internally rooted. This rootedness creates calm strength, not performative strength, not cold detachment, but quiet emotional steadiness. The kind of steadiness that no longer requires every room to approve before the nervous system can relax. This changes social interaction profoundly. You stop scanning faces constantly for approval. You stop over-monitoring tone shifts. You stop obsessing over every tiny misunderstanding. You become more present, more authentic, less defensive, because you are no longer carrying the exhausting burden of protecting image every second. Most people never realize how much energy they lose trying to manage perception. They rehearse conversations, replay interactions, imagine future judgments, prepare emotional defenses constantly. This creates chronic mental noise, but when emotional maturity grows, that noise softens. You realize your peace is too valuable to hand over to every passing opinion. This realization creates emotional independence, not isolation, not emotional coldness, but inner authority, the ability to remain connected to yourself even when external validation disappears. That authority changes everything, because now criticism becomes information instead of identity destruction. Misunderstanding becomes discomfort instead of emotional emergency. Judgment becomes temporary instead of defining. This creates enormous peace internally. The mind finally begins resting because it no longer treats every perception shift like danger. And this is what Buddhism points toward repeatedly: freedom from attachment, freedom from compulsive emotional reaction, freedom from building identity through unstable external reflection. This freedom creates extraordinary calmness, not the fake calmness of suppression, real calmness, the kind that remains even when someone speaks unfairly about you, the kind that remains even when someone misreads your intentions, the kind that remains even when others project confusion onto your life, because your center no longer moves so easily. This center develops slowly through awareness. Every time you pause instead of reacting immediately, it strengthens. Every time you survive misunderstanding without abandoning yourself, it strengthens. Every time you stop chasing external validation compulsively, it strengthens. And eventually, something shifts deeply inside. You stop fearing misunderstanding the way you once did, not because it never hurts, but because you now trust your ability to remain whole through it. That trust changes your entire emotional experience. You begin living more honestly because fear loses power. You begin speaking more directly because image matters less. You begin resting more deeply because the mind is no longer fighting endless perception battles. This is one of the rarest forms of discipline in modern life. The discipline of staying emotionally grounded in a world obsessed with external validation. The discipline of remaining calm while being misunderstood. The discipline of refusing to turn every judgment into self-destruction. The discipline of allowing people to hold incomplete versions of you without emotionally collapsing. That discipline creates peace most people never experience. Because most people spend their entire lives emotionally reacting to perception. But eventually, awareness teaches something deeper. People may misunderstand your actions, but they cannot define your essence unless you surrender that authority to them. People may criticize your choices, but criticism alone does not determine your worth. People may project onto you unfairly, but projection is not truth. Once this understanding settles into the nervous system fully, calmness becomes natural instead of forced. You no longer need to perform emotional control constantly. The body relaxes, the mind quiets, the urge to defend weakens, and slowly the fear of misunderstanding dissolves, not completely overnight, but enough that your life is no longer controlled by it. This is true emotional maturity, not becoming untouchable emotionally, but becoming stable enough that misunderstanding no longer owns your inner world. And perhaps this is one of the deepest forms of freedom available to human beings. The freedom to remain peaceful even when someone fails to see you clearly. The freedom to stop treating judgment like danger. The freedom to stop turning every misunderstanding into a war for your identity. The freedom to finally say quietly inside yourself, "They may not understand me fully, and I can still remain calm." That sentence alone can change a life. Because the moment misunderstanding stops feeling like emotional death, the mind finally begins learning how to live in peace. And after learning how to remain calm when someone misunderstands you, another hidden layer of suffering slowly begins to reveal itself. Sometimes the pain is not only about being misunderstood. Sometimes the deeper craving is wanting everyone to emotionally agree with your suffering. Because for many people, pain does not fully feel real until other people confirm it. There is a quiet desperation that appears when someone hurts deeply, but nobody around them seems to understand the weight of it. The wound itself already hurts, but what often hurts even more is the feeling of carrying pain alone. And this is where the mind begins unconsciously searching for emotional confirmation, not just understanding, agreement, validation, collective emotional support that says, "Yes, you were wronged. Yes, your suffering is real. Yes, your pain makes sense." At first, this seems natural because human beings deeply need emotional connection. Being emotionally seen during suffering can feel healing. Compassion matters, support matters, feeling understood matters. But there is a hidden danger many people never notice. Sometimes the mind becomes emotionally attached to needing everyone to agree with the pain before it allows itself to heal. And that attachment quietly creates endless suffering. Some people cannot move forward until every friend, family member, partner, or stranger confirms that they were the victim. They replay the story repeatedly, searching for stronger validation. They explain the same wound again and again, hoping for emotional certainty, not because they are attention-seeking in a shallow way, but because part of them still fears, "If others do not fully agree with my pain, maybe my pain is not real enough." This is where suffering becomes emotionally dependent on external confirmation. The mind says, "Please tell me I was justified. Please tell me I am not overreacting. Please tell me they were wrong. Please tell me my hurt deserves recognition." And underneath all of these desires is often a deeper fear. If my pain is not fully validated, I may have to face it alone. That fear is heavy because many people were never taught how to emotionally trust their own experience without needing collective agreement first. From childhood, some people learned that emotions only mattered when others approved of them. If adults dismissed their feelings, minimized their pain, or questioned their reactions constantly, the child learned something dangerous. My emotions are not trustworthy unless someone else confirms them. That child grows into an adult who constantly searches outward to determine whether their pain is valid. This creates emotional dependency instead of feeling. Emotions directly, the person immediately seeks social confirmation. They tell multiple people the story. They search for agreement. They need emotional witnesses. They need reassurance that their suffering deserves attention. Again, this does not mean emotional support is unhealthy. Human beings naturally need compassion. The problem begins when healing becomes impossible without universal emotional agreement. Because life rarely offers unanimous validation. Some people may understand your pain deeply, others may misunderstand it completely, some may minimize it, some may disagree with your interpretation, some may fail to recognize your suffering at all. If your nervous system requires collective emotional confirmation before allowing peace, your healing will always remain vulnerable to external reaction. Buddhist teachings warn about attachment precisely because attachment turns temporary emotional needs into permanent emotional dependence. The need to feel seen is human. The attachment to being constantly validated becomes suffering. This distinction matters deeply because once attachment forms, the mind stops seeking understanding and starts seeking emotional certainty. It wants proof. Proof that your suffering was justified, proof that you are innocent, proof that the other person was wrong, proof that your pain deserves recognition. And this proof becomes emotionally addictive. At first, validation soothes the nervous system temporarily. Someone says, "You are absolutely right," and for a moment relief appears, but then the relief fades, because the deeper wound remains untouched. So the mind searches for more agreement, more emotional confirmation, more reassurance, more people to validate the story. This is why some people become trapped inside pain for years. Not because the pain itself refuses to heal, but because identity becomes attached to emotional validation around the pain. The suffering becomes part of how they feel seen. This is difficult to recognize because the mind believes it is searching for justice, understanding, or healing. But sometimes it is unconsciously searching for identity reinforcement. Pain becomes emotionally stabilizing because it finally creates recognition. People listen, comfort appears, attention increases, sympathy grows. And for someone who spent years emotionally unseen, this can become psychologically powerful. The suffering finally receives acknowledgement. So unconsciously, part of the mind becomes afraid to let the suffering go completely, because letting go may feel like losing emotional visibility again. This is one of the deepest hidden traps of emotional pain. The wound becomes connected to identity, not intentionally, but gradually. The person no longer simply experiences pain. They begin organizing life around it emotionally. Conversations return to it repeatedly. Thoughts revolve around it constantly. Relationships become centered around it. The nervous system becomes attached to being emotionally recognized through suffering. Buddhism teaches that attachment to identity creates suffering because identity itself is unstable, and pain-based identity is especially fragile. Why? Because it depends on continual emotional reinforcement. The mind begins needing others to emotionally confirm the wound repeatedly in order to maintain internal certainty. This creates endless emotional dependence. One person validates you, and you feel relief. Another questions your perspective, and suddenly your entire emotional stability shakes again. Why? Because the nervous system never learned how to trust inner experience without external agreement. This is why emotionally mature healing eventually requires something very difficult. Learning how to honor your pain without demanding universal emotional confirmation. That is hard, because many people secretly fear that pain unrecognized by others becomes meaningless. But Buddhist awareness gently teaches something different. Pain remains real even when others fail to understand it fully. Your suffering does not become valid only through public agreement. Your emotions do not require collective approval in order to matter. This realization is deeply freeing because it slowly breaks the attachment between pain and external validation. You stop needing everyone to emotionally certify your experience before allowing yourself compassion. That changes healing completely. Instead of obsessively proving your pain, you begin sitting with it honestly, quietly, compassionately, without constantly needing emotional witnesses. This does not mean isolation. It does not mean suppressing emotions. It means no longer turning validation into the gatekeeper of healing. Many people remain trapped emotionally because they are still waiting for someone specific to acknowledge the damage. A parent, a partner, a friend, an ex-lover. someone who hurt them deeply. They believe, once they finally admit what they did, I will finally feel peace. But sometimes that acknowledgement never comes, not because your pain was unreal, but because the other person may not possess the emotional maturity necessary to face it honestly. This is heartbreaking, because the nervous system keeps waiting for recognition, waiting for apology, waiting for emotional justice. And while waiting, healing pauses. Buddhist teachings repeatedly remind us that attachment to outcomes creates suffering. The attachment here is not only to validation itself, it is attachment to needing validation before peace becomes possible. That attachment traps people emotionally in the past. The mind says, I cannot move forward until they fully understand my pain. But what if they never do? That question is painful but transformative, because eventually healing asks something deeper. Can you validate your own pain without needing everyone else to emotionally agree with it first? Can you say, this hurt me, without demanding universal confirmation? Can you acknowledge your suffering without building your entire identity around proving it? These questions begin creating emotional freedom, because once you stop making healing dependent on collective agreement, the nervous system slowly relaxes. You stop emotionally chasing validation everywhere. You stop repeating the same painful story endlessly, hoping for stronger emotional reaction. You stop trying to recruit people into confirming your suffering constantly, and instead you begin developing quiet inner acknowledgement. That acknowledgement is powerful, not dramatic, not performative, quiet, honest, grounded. You simply recognize your pain internally without needing to constantly defend or prove it. This is maturity. Immature pain says, everyone must agree with me before I can heal. Mature awareness says, my pain deserves compassion even when others fail to fully understand it. That difference changes everything, because collective emotional agreement is unstable. Some people will support you, others will misunderstand. Some will empathize deeply, others will judge harshly. If your healing depends entirely on external emotional consensus, your inner world will constantly remain unstable. This is especially dangerous in modern life, where emotional validation often becomes public performance. People share wounds online, searching for collective emotional reinforcement. Again, human connection itself is not wrong. Support matters deeply, but the nervous system can become addicted to public confirmation. Likes, comments, agreement, sympathy, emotional alignment. The suffering becomes externally maintained, and eventually the mind may unconsciously resist moving beyond pain because pain has become the primary source of emotional visibility. This is one reason Buddhism emphasizes awareness so strongly. Awareness allows you to see when pain is being held compassionately and when it is being unconsciously fed. There is a difference. Healthy awareness says, this hurt deeply. Attachment says, I need everyone to continuously confirm how deeply I was hurt. Healthy awareness allows movement. Attachment creates stagnation. This stagnation often appears as repetitive emotional storytelling. The person replays the same wound constantly, not because healing is happening, but because emotional identity has become fused with the suffering. The mind fears that releasing the pain may erase the emotional significance attached to it. This is why some people become defensive when healing begins. Not consciously, but unconsciously, part of them fears losing the emotional recognition that suffering provided. This can feel confusing internally. Part of the person wants peace. Another part fears becoming emotionally invisible again without the pain. This is why true healing often includes grief. Grief not only for what happened, but grief for how long suffering became the primary way of feeling emotionally seen. That realization can be heartbreaking. Because many people finally notice they spent years trying to make others emotionally validate wounds they themselves had never fully sat with quietly. They kept searching outward because inward still felt unbearable. Buddhist practice gently redirects attention inward, not to reject support, not to isolate emotionally, but to stop abandoning your own awareness while endlessly seeking confirmation outside yourself. This inward movement changes healing profoundly. Instead of asking constantly, "Do others agree my pain matters?" you begin asking, "Can I remain present with my pain compassionately even when others do not fully understand it?" That question creates strength, real strength, not performative victimhood, not emotional suppression, grounded emotional honesty. This honesty allows suffering to exist without becoming identity. That distinction matters enormously because pain is part of human life. But when pain becomes identity, suffering deepens. You stop experiencing emotions fluidly. Instead, the nervous system organizes around maintaining emotional wounds as proof of existence. This creates chronic emotional exhaustion. The mind keeps searching for more confirmation because internal stability never fully develops. This is why external validation feels temporarily soothing, but never permanently satisfying. It treats the symptom without healing the attachment underneath. The attachment says, "I need others to agree with my pain in order to feel emotionally secure." Buddhist awareness slowly loosens this attachment. You begin realizing something profound. Your suffering deserves compassion even in silence, even without applause, even without collective emotional agreement, even without dramatic recognition. This realization creates peace because your emotions stop depending entirely on public understanding. You no longer need to emotionally convince everyone of your suffering before allowing yourself tenderness. That tenderness becomes healing. Because many wounded people only offer themselves compassion after others approve of it first. If people validate them, they feel allowed to care for themselves. If people minimize them, they feel guilty for hurting. This creates enormous emotional confusion. Buddhist wisdom gently interrupts this cycle. Pain is pain. It does not become more real because more people agree with it. It does not become less real because someone dismisses it. Awareness itself honors the pain honestly, and that honesty becomes enough. Not easy, but enough. This shifts relationships too. You stop using people as emotional judges, deciding whether your suffering deserves recognition. Instead, relationships become places of support rather than emotional courts. You appreciate empathy without depending entirely on it. You value understanding without making it the sole foundation of healing. You stop emotionally collapsing every time someone disagrees with your perspective, because your nervous system slowly learns something new. My emotions are real, even when others do not fully validate them. That lesson changes emotional stability profoundly. Without it, every disagreement becomes destabilizing. Every lack of sympathy becomes painful. Every misunderstanding reopens the wound. But within a grounding, you remain emotionally connected to yourself, even when others fail to fully understand your experience. This does not remove loneliness completely. Human beings naturally long to feel seen, but the desperation weakens. You stop trying to emotionally force agreement from everyone around you. You stop exhausting yourself trying to prove your suffering repeatedly. You stop measuring the legitimacy of your pain through other people's reactions. And slowly, something quiet begins growing inside. Self-trust, not arrogance, not emotional isolation, gentle self-trust. The kind that says, "I know what I felt. I know what hurt me. I do not need universal approval to acknowledge my experience." That self-trust becomes deeply healing because it restores internal authority. Many emotionally wounded people lose internal authority completely. They constantly ask others how to interpret their own emotions. Am I overreacting? Am I wrong for feeling this? Should I be upset? They no longer trust their inner experience naturally because emotional neglect or invalidation trained them to doubt themselves. Buddhist awareness restores direct contact with experience itself. You stop arguing with your emotions constantly. You stop needing endless emotional witnesses. You stop turning suffering into identity performance. And instead, you begin quietly witnessing yourself compassionately. That witnessing becomes enough, not because connection no longer matters, but because your humanity no longer depends entirely on external emotional confirmation. This is where peace begins entering slowly. The nervous system softens, the desperate search for validation weakens, the compulsion to repeat the pain endlessly fades, and the suffering finally begins transforming instead of endlessly repeating itself. Because healing truly begins the moment your pain no longer needs an audience in order to deserve care. And slowly, this is where many people begin discovering the deepest source of their mental exhaustion. It is not only the world around them creating suffering, it is the endless inner voice constantly trying to defend who they are. The body becomes tired, the heart becomes tired, even silence becomes tiring, because inside the mind, something is always speaking, always reacting, always protecting, always arguing, always trying to preserve an image of self that feels constantly under threat. And this endless inner noise quietly steals peace from millions of people every single day. There is a voice inside many human beings that almost never rests. Even during quiet moments, it keeps speaking in the background, explaining, defending, comparing, justifying, replaying conversations, preparing future responses, protecting pride, protecting image, protecting identity. Most people believe this voice is simply who they are, but Buddhism sees it differently. Buddhist teachings often describe the ego not as a solid self, but as a restless mental construction, constantly trying to preserve and defend an identity. The ego is not evil, it is frightened. It survives through attachment, attachment to image, attachment to being right, attachment to being respected, attachment to being understood, attachment to control. And because these attachments are unstable, the ego never fully relaxes. This is why the mind becomes noisy. The ego constantly searches for danger. Someone disagrees with you. The ego reacts. Someone misunderstands you. The ego reacts. Someone criticizes you. The ego reacts. Someone ignores you. The ego reacts. Even small moments become emotionally charged because the ego interprets them as threats to identity itself. This creates enormous inner tension. Most people think they are simply thinking, but often they are mentally defending themselves against life almost all day long. They rehearse conversations, replay arguments, imagine future conflicts, prepare emotional defenses, mentally explain themselves to imaginary people, correct false perceptions in their head. The mind becomes a non-stop courtroom, and the exhausting part is that much of this battle is invisible to the outside world. Someone may look calm externally while internally fighting dozens of emotional wars at once. This is why people can feel deeply tired even after physically resting. The body may stop moving, but the ego rarely stops defending. Buddhism teaches that suffering grows when we become attached to protecting the self-image constantly. The ego wants stability through control. It wants certainty about identity. It wants reassurance that it is good enough, respected enough, loved enough, understood enough. But life cannot provide permanent reassurance. Human perception changes constantly. Opinions shift constantly. Relationships evolve constantly. People misunderstand each other constantly. so the ego remains alert all the time. It says, protect yourself, explain yourself. Do not let them think badly of you. Make sure they understand. Do not lose control of the narrative. This inner pressure becomes exhausting because the ego never feels fully safe. Even praise does not calm it permanently. Someone compliments you, and the ego feels relief briefly. Then fear returns. What if they change their mind? What if I disappoint them later? What if they discover flaws in me? This is why ego-based identity creates endless restlessness. The ego survives through maintenance. It constantly needs reinforcement, validation, recognition, approval, confirmation. Without these, it begins panicking. This is why silence becomes uncomfortable for many people. Without distraction, the ego becomes more visible. Suddenly the mind fills with commentary, defending old decisions, arguing with memories, explaining itself internally, preparing imaginary conversations. The ego cannot tolerate stillness easily because stillness threatens its illusion of control. Buddhist meditation becomes powerful precisely because it reveals this inner noise clearly. When people first sit quietly with themselves, many are shocked by how chaotic the mind actually is. Thought after thought appears endlessly. Judgment, comparison, fear, defense, memory, fantasy, planning, self-protection. Most of this mental activity revolves around maintaining identity somehow, protecting the image of me. This is why Buddhism teaches that attachment to ego creates suffering. The ego itself is unstable because it depends entirely on conditions outside itself. It needs people to respond correctly. It needs situations to unfold favorably. It needs identity to remain protected. And life refuses to cooperate consistently, so the ego keeps fighting reality endlessly. This creates the inner noise people mistake for normal living. A person walks past without greeting you. The ego creates a story. Did I do something wrong? They must dislike me. I should have acted differently. Someone criticizes your work. The ego reacts instantly. They do not respect me. I must defend myself. I need to prove my value. Someone misunderstands your intentions. The ego panics. No, that is not who I am. I need to explain immediately. They cannot think this about me. The actual event may last seconds, but the ego continues replaying it for hours or days. This is why suffering often lasts far longer than the moment itself. The ego keeps reopening emotional wounds, trying to preserve identity. And because the ego fears uncertainty deeply, it keeps searching for emotional closure constantly. It wants final understanding, final validation, final certainty, final control. But life rarely gives final certainty. Human relationships are fluid. Perception changes, emotions shift, people project, misunderstandings happen. The ego resists this reality constantly. This resistance creates endless mental noise. Buddhist wisdom offers something radically different. Instead of strengthening the ego endlessly, Buddhism teaches awareness of the ego. That awareness changes everything. Because once you begin observing the ego instead of automatically obeying it, a space opens inside the mind. You begin noticing the defensive voice instead of becoming completely fused with it. Someone criticizes you. The ego says, fight back immediately. Awareness notices the reaction calmly. Someone misunderstands you. The ego says, correct them now. Awareness pauses first. That pause is sacred, because inside that pause, freedom becomes possible. Without awareness, the ego controls behavior automatically. With awareness, you begin seeing the mechanism itself. You begin recognizing how much suffering comes not from reality, but from the ego's endless need to protect identity. This realization can feel uncomfortable because many people have built their entire sense of self around defending the ego constantly. They do not know who they are without the internal struggle. The ego creates identity through conflict. It says, "I am the misunderstood one. I am the rejected one. I am the victim. I am the intelligent one. I am the successful one. I am the good person. I am the person who must never fail." The ego constantly creates labels and then spends enormous emotional energy defending them. This defense becomes exhausting because identity itself is fragile when built externally. One criticism can shake confidence completely. One rejection can create emotional collapse. One misunderstanding can consume the mind for days. Why? Because the ego experiences these moments as attacks against the self-image it worked so hard to construct. This is why emotionally reactive people often feel mentally exhausted. The ego is always working, always calculating, always protecting, always scanning for threats, always comparing, always defending. This constant activity prevents inner peace. Peace requires spaciousness. The ego creates contraction. It narrows life around self-protection. This is why many people cannot fully enjoy the present moment. Even during peaceful experiences, the ego continues producing commentary. How am I being perceived? Do they respect me? Am I enough? What if something goes wrong? The mind never fully arrives because the ego is too busy protecting itself from possible emotional danger. Buddhist teachings gently reveal that the ego is not the true self. It is a conditioned mental structure built through memory, fear, attachment, and identification. This is important because people often mistake egoic thoughts for truth. The ego says, "You must defend yourself or you will lose worth." But awareness sees something deeper. Worth does not disappear because someone misunderstands you. The ego says, "You must control perception." Awareness sees that human perception is uncontrollable. The ego says, "You must protect your image constantly." Awareness realizes image itself is unstable and temporary. This awareness slowly softens inner noise, not by violently destroying the ego, but by no longer feeding every defensive impulse automatically. This distinction matters. Buddhism does not teach hatred toward the ego. Hatred itself becomes another egoic reaction. Instead, awareness observes gently, compassionately, clearly. You begin noticing how much fear drives defensive thinking. The ego is terrified of rejection, terrified of shame, terrified of insignificance, terrified of losing identity. So it creates endless mental activity trying to maintain emotional safety. But the tragic irony is that this endless self-defense often creates the suffering it hopes to prevent. A constantly defensive person becomes emotionally tense, reactive, anxious, hypervigilant. Relationships become strained because conversations begin revolving around protection rather than presence. The ego cannot listen deeply because it is too busy preparing defense. It cannot rest deeply because it is too busy maintaining identity. It cannot love freely because it fears vulnerability. This is why ego-based living feels so heavy internally. Everything becomes personal. A disagreement becomes disrespect. A misunderstanding becomes rejection. A boundary becomes abandonment. A critique becomes humiliation. The ego magnifies ordinary human experiences into threats against identity. Awareness gradually reduces this magnification. You begin seeing thoughts as thoughts instead of absolute reality. This creates inner spaciousness. A misunderstanding happens. Instead of immediate emotional chaos, awareness notices pain is arising. Defensiveness is arising. The urge to explain is arising. This may sound simple, but it changes the entire nervous system over time. Because now you are no longer completely trapped inside reaction, you are witnessing it, and witnessing weakens unconscious control. The ego survives through automatic identification. Awareness interrupts identification. You stop saying, "I am this reaction," and begin noticing a reaction is happening inside me. That small shift creates enormous freedom. The defensive voice may still appear, but you no longer obey it blindly. This changes communication deeply. Instead of reacting impulsively, you become capable of responding intentionally. The ego wants immediate protection. Awareness allows patience. The ego wants victory. Awareness values peace. The ego wants to prove worth. Awareness recognizes worth is not created by winning arguments. This is why truly peaceful people often appear calm during misunderstanding. It is not because they never feel hurt. It is because they are less identified with egoic defense. Their identity is less fragile, less dependent on external approval, less attached to controlling perception. This creates tremendous emotional stability. The ego hates being wrong because it experiences wrongness as identity collapse. Awareness sees being wrong as part of being human. The ego fears criticism because it interprets criticism as personal destruction. Awareness can listen without total collapse. The ego needs constant reinforcement. Awareness remains present even when validation disappears. This is why Buddhist teachings repeatedly point toward letting go of attachment to fixed identity. Not because individuality disappears completely, but because rigid attachment to image creates suffering. The ego constantly asks, "How do I preserve myself?" Awareness asks, "What happens if I stop fighting reality so much?" That question changes everything internally, because much inner noise comes from resistance itself. Resistance to criticism, resistance to misunderstanding, resistance to uncertainty, resistance to emotional discomfort. The ego believes control will create peace, but often control destroys peace instead. Awareness begins revealing another possibility. What if peace does not come from winning every emotional battle? What if peace comes from no longer needing to fight every battle internally? This realization softens the nervous system profoundly. The mind becomes quieter, less defensive, less reactive, less obsessed with self-protection. You stop carrying entire conversations in your head constantly. You stop mentally defending yourself against imaginary accusations. You stop replaying situations endlessly trying to preserve identity, because identity itself stops feeling so fragile. This does not mean becoming passive or emotionless. Healthy boundaries still matter. Truth still matters. Communication still matters. But the emotional desperation weakens. The ego says, "Protect yourself at all costs." Awareness says, "You can survive discomfort without losing yourself." That lesson creates real inner strength, because the strongest mind is not the one that wins every argument. It is the one that no longer turns every misunderstanding into a threat to existence. This is why silence becomes transformative. Silence reveals the ego clearly. Without constant distraction, the defensive voice becomes obvious. At first, this may feel uncomfortable. The ego dislikes stillness because stillness exposes how restless it truly is. But over time, awareness changes the relationship with inner noise. You stop believing every defensive thought automatically. You stop treating every emotional reaction like urgent truth. You stop allowing the ego to dominate your entire inner world. And gradually, something beautiful begins emerging underneath the noise. Stillness, real stillness, not forced silence, not emotional suppression, but genuine spaciousness inside the mind, a space where identity no longer needs constant defense, a space where misunderstanding no longer creates panic automatically. A space where criticism no longer destroys inner stability completely. This spaciousness becomes peace. And perhaps this is one of the deepest Buddhist insights of all. The ego creates endless suffering because it constantly tries to protect something unstable. An image, a role, a story, a perception. But awareness reveals something deeper than image, something quieter than identity, something untouched by temporary opinions. Once you begin living from that deeper awareness, the inner noise softens naturally, not all at once, but gradually. The need to defend weakens. The need to justify weakens. The need to prove yourself weakens. And for the first time, the mind begins resting from the exhausting task of constantly protecting who it thinks it must be. That rest is sacred, because underneath all the ego's noise, all the defense, all the mental fighting, there has always been a quieter part of you waiting patiently, a part that does not need constant validation to exist, a part that does not panic over every misunderstanding, a part that does not collapse when image changes externally, a part already whole beneath the noise. And the moment awareness reconnects with that deeper stillness, the endless courtroom inside the mind finally begins to empty. And maybe that is the deepest truth hidden beneath all this suffering. Your mind was never truly restless because people misunderstood you. It became restless because you believed your peace depended on being understood by everyone around you. So you kept explaining, kept defending, kept replaying conversations, kept searching for validation, kept trying to control how people saw you. But slowly, through these teachings, another path began to appear. A quieter path, a freer path. The path of no longer building your worth through other people's opinions. The path of allowing misunderstanding without turning it into emotional danger. The path of realizing that silence is not rejection, criticism is not destruction, and false assumptions do not erase your truth. Real peace begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself, trying to gain emotional permission from the world. And perhaps tonight, for the first time in a long time, your mind can finally loosen its grip a little. You do not need to win every argument. You do not need to correct every misunderstanding. You do not need everyone to fully understand your heart before you allow yourself rest. You are allowed to be at peace even when some people never truly see you clearly. And if this message spoke to something deep inside you, leave a comment below with this simple sentence: I no longer need everyone to understand me to protect my peace. Sometimes one sentence can become the beginning of emotional freedom for someone else reading it too. And if you want more teachings that help quiet the mind, heal emotional suffering, and bring deeper inner peace, subscribe to the channel and continue this journey with us.